Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most misunderstood hearts. Picture this, a little girl sitting alone in a grand palace, surrounded by servants who watch her every move, unable to play with other children, forbidden from walking downstairs without holding someone's hand. She shares a bedroom with her mother every single night, not out of love, but control. And this is not just any child. This is the future queen of the most powerful empire the world has ever known. But here is what no history book really tells you. Before Victoria became the symbol of an entire era, before she ruled over a quarter of the Earth's population, she was a prisoner, and her captor, the very people who were supposed to protect her. Now, before we dive deeper into this story together, I want to ask you something. If you're finding comfort in this moment, if these stories help you unwind at the end of your day, would you consider subscribing to the channel? Maybe hit that like button, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we are exploring here. And I am curious, where are you right now? Are you in bed, winding down, on a late night drive? Drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you are. I read every single one, and honestly, knowing you are out there listening makes this whole journey worthwhile. All right, dim those lights if you have not already, get comfortable, and let us step back in time to May 24th, 1819, to a palace that was more prison than home, Kensington Palace in London. Sounds elegant, does it not? The kind of place where fairy tales happen. But for little Princess Victoria, it was the stage for something much darker. A carefully orchestrated system of psychological control that would shape not just her childhood, but the way she would rule an empire and raise her own children decades later. They called it the Kensington System. And if that sounds formal and educational, let me tell you what it really was. A blueprint for breaking a child's spirit while calling it proper upbringing. Here is how it worked. Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, along with her advisor, a man named Sir John Conroy, decided that little Victoria needed to be isolated from the corrupt influence of her royal uncles. Now, that part actually made some sense. King George IV and his brothers were not exactly role models. They were known for their scandals, their drinking, their affairs. But here is where protection became something much more sinister. They did not just keep Victoria away from bad influences, they kept her away from everyone. Victoria could not have friends her own age. She could not spend time alone. She literally could not walk up or down stairs without an adult holding her hand. Not because she was clumsy, but because Conroy insisted on it as part of his system. Imagine being 7, 8, 9 years old and never being trusted to climb stairs alone. Every children's book she read was monitored. Every letter she received was opened and read before she saw it. Every conversation was supervised. She shared a bedroom with her mother every single night until the day she turned 18 and became queen. Think about that for a moment. 18 years without ever sleeping in a room by herself. 18 years of never having a single private thought, a single moment where someone was not watching. Victoria's own governess, Baroness Letson, later described it as a system designed to make Victoria dependent and biddable. In other words, to train her like you might train a dog, to obey, to never question, to remain forever grateful to the people controlling her. And at the centre of this web was Sir John Conroy. This man was not royalty. He was not even nobility, really. He was the Duchess's comptroller, her household manager. But he wanted power, and he saw little Victoria as his ticket to it. History is a bit murky on the exact nature of Conroy's relationship with Victoria's mother, but let us just say the rumours were not kind. Some whispered affair, some went further, suggesting that Conroy might actually be Victoria's real father, not the Duke of Kent who had died when Victoria was just 8 months old. Whether that was true or not, and most historians doubt it, Victoria herself seemed to believe she witnessed something inappropriate between her mother and Conroy. The Duke of Wellington, one of Britain's most famous military heroes, later claimed that Victoria had told him she caught her mother and Conroy in some familiarities. Whatever that meant exactly, it was enough to make young Victoria's skin crawl. Conroy was cruel in subtle ways. He would tease Victoria, belittle her, make her feel small. He pushed his own daughter, Victoire Conroy, on the princess as a playmate, but Victoria never trusted her. How could she? The girl was a spy for her father. Every game they played, every word Victoria said went straight back to Conroy. There is this heartbreaking quality to Victoria's childhood diaries. She wrote in them religiously, and looking back at those entries you can feel the loneliness radiating off the page. She described her childhood as rather melancholy. And that is such a Victorian understatement, is it not? Rather melancholy. Like saying the Titanic had a bit of a leak. But here is what fascinates me about this whole setup. Why? Why did Victoria's mother go along with this? She was the Duchess of Kent, a grown woman, a mother. Why did she allow Conroy to orchestrate this prison? Well, it comes down to something very human. Fear and ambition mixed together. After Victoria's father died, the Duchess was alone in a foreign country. She was German, remember, and England was not particularly welcoming to her. She spoke broken English at best. She had no money of her own, no real power. And suddenly, she had this daughter who might, just might, become Queen of England someday. That was worth something. That was leverage. But only if the Duchess could control Victoria. Only if, when Victoria took the throne, she would be dependent enough, insecure enough, to keep her mother close and, by extension, keep Conroy close. So they had a plan. When King William IV died, and he was getting older, getting sicker, if Victoria was still underage, under 18, someone would need to be regent. Someone would need to rule in her place until she came of age. Conroy and the Duchess wanted that to be the Duchess herself. And Conroy, he wanted to be Victoria's private secretary, the man whispering in her ear, controlling every decision. They were grooming Victoria not to be a queen, but to be a puppet, and they almost succeeded. In October of 1835, when Victoria was 16, she fell seriously ill with typhoid fever. For weeks she was confined to her bed, weak, feverish, barely conscious at times. And what did Conroy do? He saw an opportunity. While this teenage girl was sick, vulnerable, possibly dying, Conroy came into her room and tried to force her to sign a document. The document would have made him her personal private secretary the moment she became queen. He stood over her bed, this grown man, pressuring a feverish 16-year-old to sign away her future. And you know what Victoria did? She refused. Even in her weakest moment, burning with fever, she looked at this man who had tormented her entire life and said no. That took extraordinary strength. That took a will of iron. King William IV knew what was happening. He despised the Duchess of Kent and her evil adviser, as he called Conroy. At his final birthday dinner, with Victoria present, the elderly king stood up and made a toast, and in that toast he said he hoped to God he would live long enough to see Victoria turn 18, so that her mother would never get the chance to be regent. Imagine the scene. Victoria, 17 years old, sitting at that table, watching her uncle publicly humiliate her mother. She burst into tears. The Duchess was furious. The court was scandalized. But William was not wrong, was he? He knew exactly what kind of people surrounded his niece. And then, miracle of miracles, King William did live long enough. Just barely. Victoria turned 18 on May 24th, 1837. Exactly 1 month later, on June 20th, King William died at 2 a.m. By 6 a.m, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain were at Kensington Palace to inform Victoria that she was now Queen of England. But here is a detail that tells you everything about the Duchess of Kent. She made them wait outside, for hours. Why? Because she wanted to be the one to wake Victoria with the news. She wanted that moment of control, that one last second where she was the important one, delivering the news to her daughter. It was petty, it was small, and it was so very human. When Victoria finally was told she was queen, she did something interesting. She cried on her mother's shoulder. Just for a moment, she let herself be comforted by the woman who had helped imprison her for 18 years. Because that is the thing about complicated relationships, especially between mothers and daughters. Even when they hurt us, even when they fail us, we still crave their approval. We still want them to love us. But then, and this is the part I love, Victoria asked for one thing. She asked to be alone, actually alone, for the first time in her entire life. And she asked for her bed to be moved to her own room, that very night. She was done sharing a room with her mother. After 18 years, she was finally going to sleep by herself. And what was one of Queen Victoria's first official acts? She banished Sir John Conroy from court. Not executed, not arrested. She was not cruel. But she made it clear. He was done. Get out. Take your pension. She paid him off to avoid a scandal. But do not ever come near me again. Conroy tried to negotiate. He wanted a seat on the Privy Council. He wanted influence. Victoria gave him nothing but money and exile, and she promoted Baroness Letzen, the governess who had protected her during all those years, to be her lady attendant. The woman who had shown her kindness when no one else did was rewarded. But here is the tragic part, the part that keeps me up at night thinking about it. Victoria never really escaped that prison. Yes, she was queen. Yes, she had power. But those 18 years had done their damage. She struggled with trust her entire life. She had difficulty forming close relationships outside of a very small circle. And when she had children of her own, 9 of them, can you imagine? She repeated some of those same patterns. Not the Kensington system exactly, but the control, the inability to let them breathe, the constant monitoring and criticism. Hurt people, even when they love desperately, especially when they love desperately. There is this letter Victoria wrote much later in life, after her mother had died, where she talks about her childhood. She said that when she read her mother's private papers after her death, she realized her mother had loved her deeply, and Victoria was overwhelmed with guilt and grief because she had spent so many years angry, so many years pushing her mother away. I hardly knew how I loved her, she wrote, until I saw looming the fearful possibility of losing her. Is that not the saddest thing? This woman who ruled the greatest empire in the world, who had everything anyone could want, and she spent her childhood feeling unloved and her adulthood realizing too late that maybe, just maybe, she had been loved all along, just not in a way she could recognize, not in a way that felt like love when she needed it most. So when we think about Queen Victoria, when we picture that stern old woman in black, the grandmother of Europe, the Empress of India, maybe we should also remember the little girl who was never allowed to walk downstairs by herself, the child who shared a bedroom with her mother for 18 years, not out of comfort but control, the teenager who said no to a powerful man even when she was weak and sick and scared. Because all of that pain and loneliness and stubborn strength, that is what forged her into the woman who would rule for 63 years, the woman who would shape an entire era. But that childhood left scars, deep ones, and in our next part, we're going to explore the most complicated of all those scars, Victoria's relationship with her mother, because it turns out you can banish someone from your palace, but you cannot banish them from your heart. And when Victoria and her mother finally attempted to reconcile, when they finally tried to build something real, well, life had other plans, cruel ones. So stay with me as we untangle this incredibly human story of a woman who had everything except, for a very long time, the one thing she wanted most: to be loved for who she was, not for the crown on her head. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from loving someone you also resent. Have you ever experienced that? Where you cannot quite forgive them, but you cannot quite let them go either. Where every interaction is layered with old wounds that never properly healed? That was Victoria's relationship with her mother for most of her adult life. And what makes it even more tragic is this. They were living in the same palace, sometimes just rooms apart. For over 20 years they existed in this strange dance of proximity and distance, obligation and anger, blood ties and bitter silence. Let me paint you a picture of what happened after Victoria became queen. Remember, she had just banished Sir John Conroy, moved her bed into her own room, tasted freedom for the first time in her 18 years. And her mother, the Duchess of Kent. Victoria did not banish her. She could not. The Duchess was still her mother after all. But Victoria did something almost more painful. She demoted her. The woman who had controlled every aspect of Victoria's life suddenly found herself with no power at all, no influence, no say in anything. Victoria moved her mother to a distant apartment in Buckingham Palace, not close to the Queen's quarters, far away. And here is the thing that really stings. The Duchess had to ask permission to see her own daughter. She had to request an audience like any other subject. Can you imagine that? One day, you're sleeping in the same bedroom as your daughter, controlling who she talks to, what she reads, where she walks. The next day, you have to send a formal note asking if Her Majesty will grant you 15 minutes of her time, and often the answer was no. But in public, they were the picture of royal family harmony. They had to be. The press was watching. The public was watching. So Victoria and her mother would appear at state functions together. They would ride in carriages side by side. They would stand on balconies waving. And they would smile. They would play the part. But anyone who looked closely could see the coldness in Victoria's eyes when she looked at her mother. The stiffness in her posture, the way she would turn away just a fraction of a second too quickly. There is this letter that Victoria wrote to her uncle, King Leopold of Belgium. He was one of the few people she trusted completely, where she described her feelings about her mother. She said, and I am paraphrasing here because the original is quite long, that she felt she had been deprived of a mother's love during the years when she needed it most. That the Duchess had chosen Conroy's ambitions over her daughter's well-being. That every display of affection in public had been theatre, performance, a show for the crowds, and that Victoria could never forgive that betrayal. But here is where it gets psychologically fascinating. Because Victoria did not cut her mother off completely. She could have. She was the Queen of England. She could have sent the Duchess back to Germany, set her up in some distant estate, never seen her again. But she did not. Why? Well, psychologists today might call this an ambivalent attachment. Victoria was stuck in this terrible place between needing her mother's love and hating that she needed it. between wanting validation from the woman who raised her and knowing that validation might never come. It is one of the most human things about Victoria, honestly. This woman who commanded armies, who governed an empire, who made kings and parliaments bend to her will. She could not resolve her feelings about her mom. There were moments, though, brief ones, where you could see the cracks in Victoria's armour. When Victoria got married in 1840 to Prince Albert, and we'll talk much more about Albert later, trust me, the Duchess was there, and there are reports that Victoria actually embraced her mother at the wedding. A real embrace, not the stiff public kind. Just for a moment, Victoria let herself be someone's daughter again. Just for a moment she softened. But then the moment passed, and the wall went back up. And when Victoria started having children, 9 of them over 17 years, good Lord, she allowed her mother to visit them. The Duchess became a grandmother, which is its own kind of second chance, is it not? A way to be loving and warm without the pressure of being the primary parent. And by all accounts, the Duchess was a doting grandmother. She would bring the children gifts, tell them stories, play with them in ways she perhaps never played with Victoria. And I wonder how that felt for Victoria, watching her mother be gentle and affectionate with her grandchildren. Was it healing? Or did it just highlight everything Victoria never got as a child? Probably both. Here is a specific incident that really captures their dynamic during these years. In 1842, there was an assassination attempt on Victoria's life. Actually, there were several, but this particular one is relevant to our story. A man named John Francis pointed a gun at Victoria's carriage. The gun misfired, and Francis escaped. The next day, Victoria insisted on riding in her carriage along the exact same route at the exact same time, deliberately trying to draw Francis out so the police could catch him. It worked. He shot at her again, and this time he was arrested. It was incredibly brave and incredibly reckless, and the Duchess of Kent? She was terrified. She begged Victoria not to do it. She wrote her letters pleading with her to stay safe in the palace, and for a moment, just a moment, their roles reversed. The mother was being maternal, protective, worried about her child's safety, and Victoria basically told her mother to back off, that it was a matter of royal duty, not family concern. That the Duchess had no say in her decisions. It was harsh, but I think Victoria needed to be harsh, because if she softened, if she let her mother back in, then all those years of pain would demand to be felt. And Victoria was not ready for that. Not yet. The years kept passing. 1845, 1850, 1855. Victoria ruling, having babies, dealing with political crises. The Duchess getting older, frailer, less relevant. They settled into a pattern of polite distance, birthday visits, Christmas dinners, the bare minimum of familial obligation, and beneath it all, this ocean of unsaid things, all the hurt that never got addressed, all the apologies that never got spoken, all the love that existed but had nowhere to go because the walls between them were too high. Then, in 1859, the Duchess became seriously ill. She had an abdominal tumour, though they did not know what it was at the time. She started declining rapidly, and Victoria, who had kept her mother at arm's length for over 2 decades, suddenly felt something shift. She started visiting more, sitting by her mother's bedside, holding her hand. And the Duchess would tell her daughter stories from when Victoria was a baby, before the Kensington system, before Conroy, before everything went wrong. Stories about how the Duchess would watch baby Victoria sleep and feel overwhelmed with love, how she would sing German lullabies, how she dreamed of being a good mother. And Victoria began to wonder, what if she had been wrong? What if her mother had loved her all along, but just failed spectacularly at showing it. What if the Duchess had been manipulated by Conroy, just as much as Victoria had been? What if this woman, who Victoria had cast as the villain of her childhood, was actually just human? Flawed and frightened and doing her best in impossible circumstances. The Duchess recovered from that illness. She got better, much to everyone's relief. And Victoria thought maybe, just maybe, they had more time. Time to talk, time to heal, time to build something real. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. In March of 1861, the Duchess fell ill again. This time it was clear she was not going to recover, and Victoria moved into her mother's rooms at Frogmore House. She barely left her side. For 2 weeks, Victoria sat with her dying mother, and they talked, really talked, for perhaps the first time in Victoria's adult life. The Duchess apologised for Conroy, for the isolation, for all of it. She told Victoria over and over that she had always loved her, that she'd made terrible mistakes but never stopped loving her, and Victoria for the first time let herself believe it. On March 16th, 1861, Victoria was sitting on a little footstool beside her mother's bed holding her hand. The Duchess's breathing had become laboured, difficult, and then, very quietly, it stopped. Victoria realised her mother was no longer breathing. Prince Albert came in and gently took Victoria into the next room, and Victoria completely fell apart. She wrote to King Leopold that this was the most dreadful day of my life. This woman who she had kept at a distance for 24 years, and now she was gone. No more chances, no more time. But here is where the story gets even more heartbreaking. After the funeral, Victoria went through her mother's private papers, and she found hundreds of letters, diary entries, notes that her mother had written but never sent. Letters to Victoria saying how much she missed her, how sorry she was, how she wished things had been different. Diary entries from when Victoria was a baby, describing the overwhelming love the Duchess felt. Notes she had written after difficult visits with Victoria, trying to understand where she had gone wrong as a mother. The Duchess had kept all of it. Private evidence of a love that she could not quite express when her daughter was in the room. Victoria was devastated. She had spent decades believing her mother was cold, calculating, only interested in power through her daughter, and now she held proof that her mother had been suffering too, that the Duchess had been trapped by Conroy, by circumstances, by her own limitations, but trapped nonetheless. That she had loved her daughter desperately and failed her anyway. Victoria wrote in her journal, "My childhood all seems to crowd in upon me." And what a sentence that is. All the lonely nights, all the controlled days, all the moments of wanting her mother and having her mother right there but somehow unreachable. All of it came flooding back. But now mixed with this terrible new knowledge, her mother had loved her, had always loved her, and Victoria had never fully let herself feel that love when there was still time to do something about it. The guilt Victoria felt after her mother's death was immense. She started referring to Conroy and Baroness Letson, who Victoria had once praised, as wicked meddlers who had deliberately come between mother and daughter. She blamed them for the 24 years of coldness, but really, I think she was struggling with a harder truth, that she herself had chosen that distance, that she had built those walls brick by brick. Yes, she had reasons. God, did she have reasons. But knowing you had reasons does not always make the regret easier to bear. There is something that attachment theory and psychology talks about, this idea that the relationships we have with our parents in childhood become the template for how we connect with others throughout our lives. Victoria's relationship with her mother was what they call anxious avoidant. She desperately wanted her mother's love but protected herself by pushing her mother away. And you can see that pattern repeat in Victoria's later relationships. With her children especially, this fierce love mixed with an inability to be vulnerable, this desire for closeness that manifests as control. She became, in some ways, a version of what she resented in her mother. Not because she wanted to, but because hurt has a way of replicating itself. You know what the saddest part is? Victoria spent the rest of her life, 40 more years, grieving her mother. She kept her mother's rooms exactly as they were. She visited them often. She had her mother's letters bound in leather and would read them when she felt alone. She commissioned statues, paintings, memorials, all these tributes to a relationship that she finally understood only after it was too late to fix it. And is that not the most common human tragedy? We figure out how to love our parents right around the time we lose them. So what do we learn from this? Maybe it is this. Estrangement does not mean absence of love. Distance does not mean you do not care. Sometimes the people we push away are the ones we are most terrified of losing. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the relationships that hurt us most are with people who loved us but just did not know how to show it in a way we could receive. That does not erase the pain. It does not make the childhood loneliness okay, but it does make it more complicated than villain and victim. It makes it human. Victoria once wrote that she would give anything to have one more conversation with her mother. Just one. To say the things that needed saying. To hear her mother say she was sorry. To say, I forgive you. I love you. I understand now. But she never got that chance, and she carried that weight for the rest of her very long life. Which brings us to something we need to talk about next. Because just 8 months after losing her mother, Victoria lost someone else. Someone who had become her entire world. Someone whose death would break her so completely that she would spend the next 40 years trying to put herself back together. His name was Albert. And if you thought Victoria's relationship with her mother was complicated, well, buckle up. Because what Victoria felt for Albert was so intense, so consuming, so utterly all-encompassing, that when he died, it nearly took her with him. So let us talk about love. Real, passionate, maybe slightly unhealthy love. And what happens when the person who became your whole world suddenly leaves it. I want to tell you about the moment Victoria fell in love, and I mean really fell. The kind of falling where you lose your balance, where the ground disappears, where suddenly nothing else in the world matters except this one person. It happened on October 10th, 1839. Victoria was 20 years old, had been queen for just over 2 years, and she was exhausted. The responsibility of ruling was crushing. The loneliness was overwhelming. She had advisors, yes, but no one her own age. No one who understood what it felt like to be her. And then, one autumn evening, a carriage arrived at Windsor Castle, and out stepped her cousin Albert. Now, this was not the first time Victoria had met Albert. They had been introduced 3 years earlier when they were both 17, and Victoria had liked him then. She wrote in her diary that he was extremely handsome, with beautiful blue eyes. But she was not ready then. She was too young, too unsure of herself, still learning how to be queen. But this time was different. This time Victoria was ready. And Albert had grown into himself. He was 20 years old, tall, handsome in that classical European way, with those blue eyes that seemed to look right through to your soul. He was cultured, intelligent, interested in art and science and music. And there was something gentle about him, something kind. Victoria, who had been surrounded by people wanting things from her: power, influence, favours. Here was someone who seemed to want nothing except to know her. They spent 5 days together. Just 5 days. And by the end of it, Victoria was completely, utterly, irrevocably in love. She described him in her journal, and Victoria's journals are incredibly detailed, thank God, as having such a beautiful nose and such a sweet mouth with delicate mustachios, which is very Victorian and very specific, right? But beneath the physical descriptions, you can feel something deeper happening. She wrote that his whole appearance was beautiful, and that when he spoke she felt like she could listen forever. But here is where it gets interesting. Victoria could not just sit around waiting for Albert to propose. She was the Queen of England. Protocol demanded that she be the one to ask him. A man could not propose to the Queen. It would be too presumptuous, too forward. So Victoria had to do something that terrified her. She had to be vulnerable. She had to put herself out there and risk rejection. Can you imagine that? This woman who commanded an empire, who literally had the power of life and death over her subjects, was nervous about asking a man to marry her. On October 15th, just 5 days after Albert arrived, Victoria called him to her private rooms. She was shaking. She later wrote that her heart was pounding so hard she thought he might hear it. And she asked him. She proposed. She said something along the lines of, and I am paraphrasing because the exact words were never recorded, that she would be the happiest woman in the world if he would consent to be her husband. And Albert said yes. Of course he said yes. But in that moment, Victoria did not know he would say yes. In that moment, she was just a 20-year-old woman terrified of losing the one person who made her feel seen. They were married on February 10th, 1840, at the Chapel Royal of St. James's Palace. It was a relatively small wedding by royal standards, only about 300 guests, which for royalty is basically eloping. Victoria wore a white satin dress, which was unusual at the time. Most brides wore colours, but Victoria wanted white. She wanted to look pure, fresh, new, like she was starting her life over, and in a way, she was. Now, I need to tell you about the wedding night, because Victoria's diary entry from that night is one of the most famous pieces of romantic writing in history, and it completely shatters our idea of Victorians being prudish and repressed. Victoria wrote, and these are her actual words written in her journal that night, "I never, never spent such an evening. My dearest, dearest, dear Albert, his excessive love and affection gave me feelings of heavenly love and happiness I never could have hoped to have felt before. He clasped me in his arms, and we kissed each other again and again. His beauty, his sweetness and gentleness. Really, how can I ever be thankful enough to have such a husband?" The exclamation points, the capital letters, the sheer joy radiating off the page. This is not the stiff, repressed Victoria we think we know. This is a woman overwhelmed with physical passion and emotional connection. She continues, "To be called by names of tenderness I have never yet heard used to me before was bliss beyond belief. Oh, this was the happiest day of my life." And remember, Victoria had never been shown much physical affection as a child. She'd been controlled, monitored, kept at a distance. And now, here was someone who touched her with love, who held her, who whispered sweet things to her. It must have been like being born again. But here is where we need to talk about something a bit more complex. Because while this grand love story is beautiful, it is also a little concerning when you look at it closely. Victoria became completely dependent on Albert. Not just emotionally, though that too, but practically. She could not make a decision without him. She wrote that she did nothing moved not a finger, arranged not a print or photograph without his approval. She would not even choose her own clothes without asking if he liked them. Now, on one hand, this was a partnership. Albert was brilliant. He helped her navigate politics, he advised her on appointments, he managed the household. He essentially became her private secretary, her chief advisor, her everything. And Victoria loved having someone she could trust completely after years of being surrounded by people with agendas. But on the other hand, and I say this gently, this is not exactly healthy, is it? This is codependency. This is merging your identity so completely with another person that you lose track of where you end and they begin. Have you ever been in a relationship like that, where you cannot imagine making even small decisions without consulting the other person, where their opinion matters more than your own? It feels like love. It feels like partnership. But it is also a little scary, because what happens when that person is not there anymore? What happens when you have built your entire sense of self around someone else and suddenly they are gone? And Victoria knew this about herself. There is a letter she wrote to her daughter Vicki years later, where she admitted that her dependence on Albert was probably excessive. She wrote something like, and again I am paraphrasing, that she had given Albert too much power over her thoughts and actions, that she had stopped trusting her own judgment, that she had become almost like a child again, looking to him for constant guidance and approval. It is heartbreaking because you can hear the self-awareness in her words. She knew, but she could not help herself, or maybe she did not want to help herself. Maybe being that consumed by love felt better than the alternative, which was being alone. Here is a specific example that really illustrates this. In 1842, Victoria was pregnant with her second child, and there was a minor political crisis, something about a vote in Parliament. I honestly forget the details because it was relatively minor, but Victoria needed to make a decision, and Albert was out for the day. Just out. He would be back in a few hours, but Victoria could not decide. She literally sat there for hours, waiting for Albert to return because she could not trust her own judgment enough to act. And when Albert finally came home and made the decision in about 5 minutes, Victoria was relieved. Not frustrated with herself, relieved. Because Albert had saved her from having to trust herself. Now, I am not saying Albert was controlling or manipulative. By all accounts, he was a good man who loved Victoria deeply. He was faithful, unlike many men of his era. He was devoted to their children. He worked incredibly hard managing the monarchy's business. He did not abuse his influence. But good intentions do not change the psychological reality. Victoria had made Albert her entire world, and that is a lot of pressure to put on one person. It is also a very vulnerable position to put yourself in. There is this concept in psychology called differentiation. It is the ability to remain yourself even when you are close to someone, to have your own thoughts, feelings, preferences, while still being connected to your partner. And Victoria and Albert had very low differentiation. They were enmeshed. Victoria often said they were one soul in two bodies, which sounds romantic. But it also means if one body fails, the soul has nowhere to go. Do you see what I mean? But let us talk about the good parts, because there were many. Victoria and Albert shared a deep intellectual connection. They would discuss politics, philosophy, social issues. Albert introduced Victoria to new ideas about social reform, about how the monarchy could be a force for good. He organised the Great Exhibition of 1851, this massive World's Fair that showcased British innovation and brought the country together. And Victoria was his biggest supporter. She was so proud of him. You can feel it in her writing. She thought he was the smartest, most capable man in the world, and maybe he was, but also, when you are that in love, everyone else looks dim by comparison, do they not? They also shared a passionate physical relationship. I mentioned the wedding night diary entry, but it was not just the beginning. Victoria's diaries throughout their marriage are filled with references to their physical intimacy. She loved being pregnant, not because of the pregnancy itself, she hated that part, but because it meant they had been together. She wrote to a friend once that the only consolation for the misery of pregnancy was remembering the cause of it, which is Victorian speak for at least the sex was good. I am laughing a little because it is so human. This queen, this symbol of an entire era of supposed repression, was just a woman who really enjoyed sleeping with her husband, and Albert was equally devoted. There are letters from him to his brother where he talks about Victoria with such tenderness. He calls her my little wife and writes about how her happiness is his entire purpose, which is sweet, but again, pressure. What a burden to be someone's entire purpose. What happens when you cannot make them happy? What happens when you are tired, or sick, or just having a bad day? The weight of being someone's everything is immense. Victoria and Albert had 21 years together. 21 years of this intense, consuming, all-encompassing love. And during those years, Victoria was happy. Maybe happier than she had ever been, or would ever be again. She had found what she'd been looking for her entire lonely childhood. Someone who loved her unconditionally. Someone she could trust. Someone who made her feel safe. And she gave herself over to that love completely. She submerged herself in it. She let it define her. She stopped being Victoria the woman and became Victoria and Albert, one hyphenated unit. And the thing is, while they were both alive, it worked. They balanced each other. Albert grounded Victoria's emotional intensity with his rationality. Victoria softened Albert's sometimes rigid propriety with her warmth. They were a team. They were partners in the truest sense, and in many ways their marriage became the model for Victorian domesticity. The ideal of the loving, faithful, respectable couple. They made marriage look like this beautiful, sacred bond, which it can be, but it can also be a trap if you're not careful, if you give too much, if you lose yourself in the process of loving someone else. There is a moment I want to share with you. It is from 1861, just months before Albert died, though neither of them knew that yet. They were at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, one of their favourite places, and Victoria wrote in her journal about a walk they took together, just the two of them through the hills, and she described feeling so happy, so safe, so loved. She wrote that she wished that moment could last forever, that they could stay like that, walking, talking, together, for all of eternity. And reading that entry now, knowing what was coming, it breaks my heart. Because Victoria was about to learn the cruelest lesson life can teach, that when you make someone your whole world, losing them does not just break your heart. It destroys your reality. It obliterates your sense of self. It leaves you with nothing to stand on because you built your entire foundation on one person. And people, no matter how wonderful, are not meant to be foundations. They are not solid enough. They are not permanent enough. They are human, and humans die. So what happened when Albert died? What happened when Victoria's entire world collapsed? Well, that is what we need to talk about next. Because December 14th, 1861 was not just the day Prince Albert died. It was the day Queen Victoria in many ways died too. The woman who emerged from that loss was someone new, someone colder, harder, more isolated, someone who would spend the next 40 years of her life trying to bring Albert back through sheer force of will and grief. So stay with me, because we are about to enter the darkest chapter of Victoria's story. And I warn you now, it is going to hurt. You would think that after finding the love of her life, after finally feeling safe and cherished, Victoria's story would become easier. That happiness would simply unfold. But life has a way of complicating even our greatest joys, does it not? And for Victoria, the shadow side of her happiness with Albert came wrapped in something society told her should be the most natural, most beautiful thing in the world: motherhood. Except Victoria hated it, and I do not mean she found it challenging or difficult. I mean she genuinely, viscerally hated being pregnant, which, in Victorian England, when a woman's highest calling was supposedly to be a mother, was not exactly something you could say out loud, but Victoria said it anyway. In her private letters and journals she said it over and over, and thank God she did, because it gives us this rare, honest window into something women throughout history have felt, but been too afraid to admit. Let me give you the timeline first, because the sheer speed of it is exhausting just to think about. Victoria and Albert married in February 1840. Their first child, a daughter also named Victoria, they called her Vicki, was born in November 1840. 9 months. Almost to the day. And Victoria was not pleased. She was 42 years old. Sorry, I meant she was 20 years old, though I suspect she felt about 42 by the end of it all. She'd been queen for 3 years, was just settling into married life, and suddenly she was pregnant. She wrote to King Leopold, her uncle, saying that she had the greatest horror of having children and would rather have none. This is before she even had her first baby. She already knew she was not going to enjoy this. And here is the thing. Victoria loved sex. We established that. She was passionate, physical, deeply connected to Albert in that way, but she hated what came after. She called pregnancy the shadow side of marriage. She described it as an unhappy condition. She told her daughter Vicki years later that being pregnant made her feel like a dog or a cow. Those are her exact words, a dog or a cow, breeding animals. She felt reduced to nothing more than a vessel for producing heirs. And the irony is brutal, right? Victoria finally found someone who treated her like a whole person, who valued her mind and her opinions, who made her feel seen and loved. And then pregnancy came along and reduced her right back to being just a body, just a function, just a royal womb doing its duty. But Victoria could not stop having children. Why? Well, partly because birth control in 1840s Britain was unreliable at best and non-existent at worst. But also, and Victoria was honest about this too, because stopping would mean stopping the physical intimacy with Albert, and she was not willing to give that up. So she was trapped in this awful cycle. She loved being with Albert, which led to pregnancy, which she hated, which led to birth, which was traumatic, which led to recovery, which eventually led back to being with Albert, which led to pregnancy again. 9 times. 9 times she went through this cycle over 17 years. That is barely any time to recover between pregnancies. Her body must have been exhausted. Her mind must have been screaming. And it was not just the physical discomfort, though that was bad enough. It was the loss of autonomy. When Victoria was pregnant, especially in the later months, she could not perform all her royal duties. The conventions of the time demanded that pregnant women, especially royal pregnant women, reduce their public appearances. So Albert would step in as her regent. He would attend meetings she could not attend. He would make decisions she could not make. He would essentially be the monarch in her place, and Victoria hated that. She wrote about feeling caged and useless during her pregnancies. This woman who had fought so hard to maintain her independence as queen, who had battled her mother and Conroy to have her own power, was now watching that power slip away to her husband every time she got pregnant. Now, do not get me wrong. Albert was not being malicious. He was trying to help. He was taking on responsibilities so Victoria could rest. But intention does not change impact, does it? Victoria felt diminished. She felt like her body was betraying her ambitions, and there was nothing she could do about it. Between November 1840, when Vicki was born, and August 1844, when her fourth child Alfred was born, Victoria had only 17 pregnancy-free months. 17 months out of 45 where she actually felt like herself, where she had full control of her life and her monarchy. That is less than 40% of those years. More than half her early 20s were spent either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or about to become pregnant again. And then there is what happened after the births. Today, we have a name for it: postpartum depression. We understand it as a medical condition, a chemical imbalance in the brain that can happen after childbirth. We have treatments, therapies, support systems. But in Victorian England, they had nothing. They did not even have the vocabulary to describe it. So when Victoria fell into deep sadness after giving birth, when she experienced what she called lowness and a tendency to cry, when she felt disconnected from her baby and from herself, nobody knew what to do. They just told her to rest, to be grateful, to remember how blessed she was, which, as anyone who has experienced depression knows, is spectacularly unhelpful advice. After the birth of her second child, Bertie, the future King Edward VII, Victoria experienced something even more frightening. She had hallucinations. She heard voices. She later told her doctor that she feared she was losing her mind. Can you imagine how terrifying that must have been? You are the Queen of England. You have responsibilities, duties, an entire empire depending on you. And you cannot trust your own mind. You cannot tell what is real and what is not. And you cannot tell anyone because admitting mental instability could literally cost you your throne. There were precedents for this. Her grandfather, King George III, had gone mad. What we now think was probably porphyria, a genetic disorder, but at the time it was just called madness, and he lost his power. Victoria knew the story. She knew what happened to monarchs who could not control their minds, so she kept quiet. She suffered in silence. She white-knuckled her way through it until the symptoms eventually faded. But they left scars, deep psychological scars. Here is something that really gets me. Victoria later wrote to her eldest daughter Vicki, who was pregnant herself, warning her about these symptoms. She told Vicki to expect lowness after birth, to expect crying for no reason, to expect feeling disconnected. And she said it in such a matter-of-fact way, like this was just part of being a woman, part of being a mother. She did not frame it as a medical issue that needed treatment. She framed it as something you just endured, something you survived. And that breaks my heart, because imagine if Victoria had gotten help. Imagine if someone had said, "This is not your fault. This is chemistry. This is your brain recovering from massive hormonal shifts. We can help you." Would her experience of motherhood have been different? Would she have bonded better with her children? Would those early years have been less dark? But she did not get that help. So she struggled, and she resented her pregnancies even more because they led not just to physical discomfort but to mental anguish. She started to see her children almost as the cause of her suffering, which is an awful position to be in because she also loved them. Of course she loved them. But love and resentment can coexist, can they not? You can love someone and also resent what they cost you. And what Victoria's children cost her was her sense of self, her mental stability, her political power, and her bodily autonomy for almost 2 decades of her life. There is this one letter she wrote that I find particularly revealing. She's writing to Vicki again. She wrote to Vicki constantly, over 8,000 letters over the years, which is its own kind of fascinating and slightly concerning. And she's talking about breastfeeding. Now, in Victorian upper-class society, it was actually uncommon for mothers to breastfeed their own children. They would hire wet nurses, women whose job was to breastfeed other people's babies. But some of Victoria's daughters chose to breastfeed their own children, and Victoria was appalled. She wrote, and these are her actual words, "I think much more of our being like a cow or a dog at such moments." And when she found out that Vicki and another daughter, Alice, had secretly breastfed their babies, she was furious. She called them cows in her diary. She said it made her hair stand on end. Now, why did this bother her so much? I think it is because breastfeeding represented to Victoria the ultimate reduction of a woman to just a body, just a biological function. She had spent her entire life trying to be seen as more than that, more than a vessel for producing heirs, more than pretty face on coins, more than a womb with a crown. She wanted to be valued for her mind, her decisions, her leadership, and breastfeeding felt like a regression, like saying, no, your highest purpose is actually just this physical animal thing, and she rejected that with every fibre of her being. But here is the complicated part. Victoria did love her children. Her diaries and letters are full of moments of genuine affection. She would describe baby Vicki as dear little thing and write about enjoying bath time with her. She worried constantly when her children were sick. She cried when they left home. The love was real. But it was tangled up with so much other stuff. Resentment about the pregnancies, frustration about losing her autonomy, fear about her mental state, anxiety about being a good mother when she had never had a good mother herself. It was a mess, a beautiful, human, complicated mess. And society did not make it any easier. Because while Victoria was privately suffering, publicly she had to perform the role of the ideal Victorian mother. She and Albert were setting the standard for what royal family life should look like. They were the model couple, the perfect parents. Newspapers would write glowing articles about their domestic bliss. Artists would paint portraits of them surrounded by their beautiful children, and Victoria had to smile for those portraits. She had to play along, even when she was miserable, even when she was struggling, even when she just wanted to scream that she never wanted to be pregnant again. She had to be the symbol of maternal devotion, because that is what queens did. That is what women did. There is this concept in psychology called cognitive dissonance. It is when you hold 2 contradictory beliefs at the same time, and it creates this uncomfortable tension in your mind. Victoria was experiencing massive cognitive dissonance. She believed she was supposed to love being a mother. Society told her that. Religion told her that. Everyone around her told her that. But she did not. Or rather, she loved her children but hated the process of becoming a mother, and she could not reconcile those 2 things. So she felt guilty. Guilty for not being naturally maternal. Guilty for resenting her pregnancies. Guilty for sometimes looking at her children and thinking about what they had cost her. And that guilt compounded the depression, which made the whole thing worse. Do you think Victoria was alone in feeling this way? Do you think she was the only woman in history who loved her children but hated being pregnant? Of course not. But she might have been one of the only women in her position who was honest about it. Most women, especially royal women, kept these feelings hidden. They put on the public face of joyful motherhood and suffered privately. But Victoria wrote it down. She said it out loud, at least to the people closest to her. And that honesty, as painful as it is to read, is also incredibly valuable. Because it gives permission. It says you are not a monster for feeling this way. You're not broken. This is a valid human experience. Now here is something else we need to talk about. Victoria's doctor, Sir James Clark, eventually suggested that maybe she should stop having children, that 9 was enough, that her body and her mind needed rest, and Victoria refused. She said no. Why? Because stopping would require either abstaining from sex with Albert or using the primitive birth control methods available at the time, which were unreliable and unpleasant. And Victoria was not willing to lose that connection with Albert. That physical intimacy was too important to her. It was the foundation of their relationship, so she chose to keep risking pregnancy rather than change that aspect of their marriage. And I cannot decide if that is romantic or tragic or maybe both. This woman who hated pregnancy so much was willing to keep going through it rather than give up the physical closeness with her husband. That tells you something about her priorities. That tells you something about how central Albert was to her identity. But it also tells you something about the lack of options women had. Even a queen, even the most powerful woman in the world, could not control her own reproduction effectively. She was at the mercy of biology and limited medical knowledge. And that must have been so frustrating. To have all this power in the public sphere, commanding armies, influencing governments, ruling an empire, and no power at all over her own body, over when and whether she became pregnant. That asymmetry is stark. So what do we take away from all this? I think Victoria's experience of motherhood teaches us a few things. First, that you can love your children and still hate the process of having them. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. Second, that maternal ambivalence is real, and has always been real, even when society pretends it does not exist. Third, that postpartum mental health issues are not a modern invention. Women have been experiencing them throughout history. They just did not have names for them or treatments for them. And fourth, that the pressure to perform happiness, to pretend everything is fine when it is not, can be just as damaging as the original struggle. Victoria survived her childbearing years. All 9 of her children lived to adulthood, which was actually remarkable for that era when infant mortality was high even in royal families. But the cost to Victoria was significant. Those 17 years shaped how she saw herself, how she related to her children, how she understood her role as a woman versus her role as a monarch. And they left her exhausted. Physically, mentally, emotionally exhausted. She wrote in her journal after the birth of her last child, Beatrice, in 1857, something along the lines of being grateful that this was finally over, that she could reclaim her body, that she could be herself again without the constant cycle of pregnancy and recovery. But just 4 years later, everything would change in a way Victoria could never have anticipated. Because in 1861, right when she was finally free from childbearing, right when she and Albert could have enjoyed this new phase of their lives together, disaster struck. Albert fell ill, and Victoria, who had spent so much of her adult life frustrated by the constraints of motherhood, was about to discover a pain that made all those previous struggles seem small by comparison. So we need to talk about December 14th, 1861. We need to talk about the day Victoria lost Albert. Because that day did not just break her heart, it shattered her reality. And the woman who emerged from that loss would never be the same. Stay with me, because this next part is going to be rough. But it is also essential to understanding who Victoria truly was beneath that crown. When someone you love dies, there is this moment, maybe you have experienced it, where your brain refuses to accept it, where you keep thinking they will walk through the door any second, where everything feels unreal, like you're watching yourself from outside your body. Victoria lived in that moment for 3 years. 3 full years where she could not quite believe Albert was gone, where she waited for him to come back, where she kept his rooms exactly as they were the day he died, because surely he would need them when he returned. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to November 1861, when everything started to fall apart. Albert was 42 years old. He was tired. He'd been working constantly for years, helping Victoria run the empire, organising state functions, managing their household, raising their children, and he had not been feeling well for a while. He had stomach problems, headaches, insomnia. But he kept working because that is what he did. That is who he was. And then, in November, their eldest son Bertie, the Prince of Wales, the future king, got himself into a scandal. He was 20 years old, at Cambridge University, and there were rumours of an affair with an actress. Now, in 2024, we would barely blink at that. But in 1861, for the heir to the British throne, this was catastrophic. Albert was devastated, not just disappointed, but genuinely heartbroken. He had such high hopes for Bertie. He had planned out Bertie's entire education, his training, his path to becoming a good king. And Bertie had, in Albert's view, thrown it all away for some momentary pleasure with a woman of questionable reputation. So Albert did what Victorian fathers did. He went to confront his son. In late November, in cold, rainy weather, Albert travelled to Cambridge. He walked around the grounds with Bertie for hours, lecturing him, trying to understand what had happened, trying to fix this problem. And Albert got soaked. He came back to Windsor Castle cold, wet, exhausted. And he never really recovered. By early December, Albert was clearly sick. He had a fever. He was weak. He could not sleep. The doctors were called, and they diagnosed him with typhoid fever, which was a death sentence in those days. There were no antibiotics, no real treatments. You either survived or you did not, and it mostly depended on your immune system and luck. Victoria watched her husband deteriorate day by day. He could not eat. He was confused. He would have moments of clarity where he seemed like himself, and then he would drift away again into fever dreams. And Victoria refused to believe he would die. She kept telling everyone he would recover. He had to recover. He was only 42. They had so many years left together. This could not be happening. December 14th, 1861, a Saturday. It was getting dark outside. Albert had been in bed for weeks. Victoria had barely left his side. Their children were there, hovering in the hallways, waiting for news. And at about 10 minutes to 11 that night, Albert's breathing changed. It became laboured, rattling. Victoria was holding his hand. She was leaning over him, talking to him, begging him to stay with her. And then he took one more breath, and then nothing. Silence. Prince Albert was dead. Victoria's scream was heard throughout Windsor Castle. It was primal. It was the sound of something breaking that could never be fixed. She collapsed onto his body, sobbing, refusing to let go. Her doctors and attendants had to physically pull her away. She kept saying no, 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 over and over. She could not process it. Her brain could not accept that the man who had been her entire world for 21 years was just gone in an instant, without warning, without giving her time to prepare. She wrote later, in her journal, and I'm going to read you her exact words because they're so raw, so honest. those paroxysms of despair and yearning and longing and of daily, nightly longing to die, for the first 3 years never left me. Read that again. Daily, nightly longing to die, for 3 years. Victoria, the queen of the most powerful empire on earth, wanted to die every single day for 3 years. She thought about it constantly, how she could join Albert, how she could escape this pain that felt like it was physically tearing her apart. But she could not. She had a duty. She had children. She had a country depending on her. So she had to keep living even though living felt impossible. Do you know what she did immediately after Albert died? She started giving orders. Even in her grief, even while she was still sobbing, she was making decisions. She ordered that Albert's rooms be preserved exactly as they were. His clothes were to be laid out every day as if he were still alive. Fresh water was to be brought to his washing basin every morning. His papers were to remain on his desk untouched. For the rest of Victoria's life, 40 years, those rooms stayed frozen in time. Servants would come in daily to dust to refresh the water, to maintain everything as if Albert might walk in at any moment. It was like a museum, or a shrine, or maybe a manifestation of denial so powerful it became physical reality. And Victoria started wearing black, head to toe black, mourning clothes. In Victorian England, widows were expected to wear mourning clothes for a certain period, usually about 2 years, then gradually transitioning back to regular colours. But Victoria never stopped. She wore black every single day for the remaining 40 years of her life. Black dresses, black veils, black jewellery. She became a living monument to her dead husband. People started calling her the Widow of Windsor because she basically disappeared from public view. She retreated to Windsor Castle and refused to come out. Now, here is where it gets complicated. Because Victorian society had very specific rules about mourning and grief. And there was debate even then about whether Victoria's grief was normal or pathological. Some people, her doctors, some members of her government, thought she was experiencing what we would now call clinical depression. That this had gone beyond normal grief into something that required medical intervention. But others argued that she was just being a proper Victorian widow, that her devotion to Albert's memory was admirable, that her refusal to move on showed the depth of her love. So which was it? Was Victoria depressed, or was she just grieving in the way her culture said she should? Modern psychologists have gone back and analysed Victoria's own writings from this period, and most agree this was clinical depression. The duration, years and years without improvement, the intensity of the symptoms, the death wishes, the inability to function normally, the complete withdrawal from life. These are not characteristics of healthy grief, even by Victorian standards. Healthy grief, even prolonged grief, allows for moments of joy, moments of engagement with life. Victoria had none of that. For 3 years, she barely functioned. She would not attend public events. She would not open Parliament in person. She would not do the ceremonial duties that were literally part of her job description as Queen. Her government was getting nervous. The public was getting restless. And here is something that is going to sound harsh, but it is true. Victoria's prolonged seclusion was threatening the monarchy itself. Britain in the 1860s was not universally pro-monarchy. There were significant Republican movements, people who thought maybe the country did not need a queen at all. Maybe they should become a republic like France or America. And when the queen disappeared from public view, when she stopped being visible to her people, those Republican sentiments grew. Newspapers started publishing critical articles. Politicians started openly questioning whether they should keep funding a monarchy that was not performing its duties. There were real concerns that the monarchy might not survive Victoria's grief. But Victoria did not care, or could not care. She was drowning. Everything reminded her of Albert. Every room in every palace, every piece of music, every meal. She could not eat at the same table where they had dined together. Every decision she had to make alone that Albert would have helped her with. The weight of it crushed her. She wrote to her uncle Leopold, "How I, who leant on him for all and everything, without whom I did nothing, moved not a finger, arranged not a print or photograph, did not put on a gown or bonnet if he did not approve it, shall go on, to live, to move, to help myself in difficult moments." Do you hear the dependency in that sentence? She did nothing without his approval. Nothing. And now he was gone, and she had no idea how to function. This is what I was talking about earlier, the danger of making someone your entire world. Because when they leave, you have nothing left to stand on. Victoria had built her entire identity around being Albert's wife. Victoria and Albert. One unit. And now she was just Victoria again, but she did not remember how to be just Victoria. She had forgotten. Or maybe she never knew in the first place. There is this heartbreaking detail. Victoria would talk to Albert's portrait. She would have full conversations with it, telling him about her day, asking his advice, waiting as if the painting might answer back. She would wear a locket with his hair in it. She would sleep with his nightshirt beside her in bed. And on the anniversary of his death every year, she would spend the entire day in his rooms, sitting in his chair, touching his things, weeping. For 40 years she did this. December 14th became sacred to her, untouchable. She would cancel all appointments, refuse all visitors, and just grieve, as intensely in year 40 as in year 1. Now, some of Victoria's behaviour during this time crosses the line from grief into what we might call complicated bereavement or prolonged grief disorder. Modern diagnostic criteria say that if grief is still severely impacting your ability to function after about 6 months, it has become something that needs treatment. Victoria went years, and the question becomes, was anyone helping her? Were her doctors trying to treat her depression? And the answer is sort of. They tried. They gave her tonics and potions and rest cures. They encouraged her to travel, to change scenery, to gradually resume her duties. And eventually, very slowly, she did start to come back to life. But it took years, and she was never the same. One thing that seemed to help, oddly enough, was work. When Victoria finally did start engaging with her duties again, reading government papers, making decisions, meeting with ministers, she found that having something to focus on, something that demanded her attention, gave her brief respites from the grief. Not because the grief went away, but because for a few hours she could think about something else. She could be useful. She could fulfill her role. And I think that is what ultimately saved her from completely succumbing to the depression. Duty, the sense that people needed her, that she had responsibilities that could not be abandoned no matter how much pain she was in. But it came at a cost. The Victoria who emerged from those years of mourning was harder, colder, less trusting. She had always been emotional and temperamental, but now she was also brittle, quick to anger, demanding. She expected everyone around her to honour Albert's memory the way she did. She got furious if anyone suggested she was mourning too long or too intensely. She made her household staff wear mourning colours. She commissioned hundreds of statues and memorials to Albert all over Britain. She named buildings after him. She even named a whole era of British history after him. The Albert Memorial in Hyde Park is this massive ornate structure that took years to build and cost a fortune. It is beautiful. It is also a manifestation of grief so enormous it needed to be carved in stone and gilded in gold. Here is something that I find particularly poignant. Victoria blamed Bertie for Albert's death. Remember that trip to Cambridge in the cold rain? Victoria convinced herself that the stress of dealing with Bertie's scandal had weakened Albert's immune system and made him susceptible to typhoid. She genuinely believed that if Bertie had behaved himself, Albert would still be alive, and she told Bertie this, repeatedly, for years. Can you imagine? Your father dies, and your mother, the Queen, tells you it is your fault, that you killed him. Bertie was 20 years old, dealing with his own grief, and he had to carry his mother's blame on top of it. Their relationship never recovered. Even decades later, even when Bertie was middle-aged, Victoria could barely look at him without seeing the son she believed had caused Albert's death. It was unfair. It was cruel. But grief makes us cruel sometimes, does it not? When we're in that much pain, we need someone to blame. We need it to make sense, and typhoid fever does not make sense. But a careless son causing stress, that makes sense. That gives her someone to be angry at. The question that haunted Victoria, and this came out in her later writings, was whether she could have prevented Albert's death. Should she have made him rest more? Should she have called better doctors? Should she have known sooner how serious it was? This is something everyone who loses someone suddenly struggles with. The what-ifs, the if only I had, the desperate desire to rewind time and do things differently. Victoria spent years torturing herself with these questions, and of course, the answer is, there was nothing she could have done. Typhoid fever in 1861 was going to kill you, or not kill you, regardless of what anyone did. But knowing that intellectually does not stop the emotional spiral, does it? It does not stop the guilt. So here is what Victoria's grief teaches us, I think. First, that there is no right way to grieve. Victoria's grief was extreme, prolonged, all-consuming. But it was hers. It was genuine, and judging it does not help anyone. Second, that grief can become depression, and when it does, it needs to be treated as a medical condition, not just an emotional state. Third, that depending entirely on one person for your sense of identity and purpose is dangerous. Not because that person will definitely leave, though they might, but because it leaves you with no foundation when they do. And fourth, that sometimes the only thing that gets us through impossible pain is duty. Having something outside ourselves that demands we keep going, even when we do not want to. Victoria did eventually return to public life, very gradually, very reluctantly. But she did it. She opened Parliament again, she attended some public functions, she went to Scotland to Balmoral Castle, which became her sanctuary because she and Albert had been happy there. She started engaging with her government ministers again, making decisions, ruling. But she was different. She was the widow of Windsor for the rest of her life. Every photograph, every portrait from her later years shows her in black. That severe, unsmiling face that we associate with Victorian repression. That was grief. That was a woman who had loved so completely that when love left, it took all the softness with it. But something interesting happened during those long years of seclusion. Something unexpected. Victoria formed a new relationship, a controversial one that would give her comfort but also scandalise her court and her family. His name was John Brown. He was a Scottish servant, and he became, in many ways, Albert's replacement in Victoria's daily life. Not romantically. Well, rumours abounded, but we will get into that. The point is, Victoria found a way to keep living, to keep functioning, to find small moments of comfort in an otherwise unbearable existence. And that brings us to our next chapter in this complicated story, because John Brown's relationship with Victoria tells us something profound about grief, about human need, about how we find ways to survive when survival seems impossible. So stay close, because this next part is going to challenge everything you think you know about Queen Victoria and proper Victorian behaviour. Trust me, it is worth it. Grief does strange things to us. Sometimes it makes us retreat into ourselves, building walls so high that nobody can reach us. But sometimes, and this is what happened with Victoria, grief makes us desperately hungry for any kind of human connection that feels real, for someone who does not tiptoe around our pain, for someone who treats us like a person instead of a fragile thing that might shatter if handled wrong. And for Victoria, in the depths of her mourning, that person turned out to be a Scottish gillie named John Brown. And oh, did the world have opinions about that? Let me paint you a picture of who John Brown was, because the story only makes sense if you understand the context. Brown was born in 1826 in the Scottish Highlands to a farming family. He was working class, rough around the edges. He spoke with a thick Scottish accent that many people at court could barely understand. He had no formal education to speak of. He was not refined or cultured or anything that you would expect from someone in the Queen's inner circle. He was a gillie, essentially a hunting and fishing guide, and later a groom who cared for horses. He had worked on the Balmoral estate in Scotland since 1849, back when Albert was alive. In fact, it was Albert who had originally noticed Brown's skill with horses and his reliability. Brown had served the royal family for years in that capacity, present but invisible, the way servants were supposed to be. But after Albert died, something shifted. Victoria spent more and more time at Balmoral because it was the place where she and Albert had been happiest, and she started to rely on John Brown more and more. At first, it was practical. He would lead her pony when she went riding. He would help her in and out of carriages. He would organise outdoor excursions. But gradually Brown became something more. He became her constant companion, her confidant, the one person who seemed to treat her not as a grieving queen who needed to be handled delicately, but as a regular person who needed some fresh air and honest conversation. And here is what made Brown so unusual, so valuable to Victoria. He did not patronise her. Everyone else around Victoria was walking on eggshells, trying not to upset her, agreeing with everything she said, treating her like she might break at any moment. But Brown told her when she was being ridiculous. He argued with her. He spoke to her bluntly, in that Scottish way that does not bother with excessive politeness. He would say things like, "Woman, you need to get out of that stuffy room and get some exercise," or "That will do now," when she was working herself into a state. Can you imagine anyone else talking to Queen Victoria like that? But she loved it. She needed it. Because everyone treating you like you are made of glass just reinforces the feeling that you are broken. Brown treated her like she was strong enough to handle the truth, like she was still herself, still capable, just sad. By 1865, about 4 years after Albert's death, Brown had been promoted to the Queen's Highland Servant, which was a made-up title really, because what it actually meant was John Brown is now with the Queen constantly, and everyone else needs to deal with it. He would bring her tea. He would wrap her in shawls when she was cold. He would fuss over her in this gruff, practical way. He called her woman, in his Scottish accent, which should have been completely inappropriate but somehow was not between them. And Victoria started to smile again. Not big smiles, not yet, but small ones. Brief moments where the grief lifted just enough to let a little light in. But the British court, and the British public. They did not know what to make of this. Here was the Queen of England, the Empress of India, the widow of beloved Prince Albert, spending all her time with a Scottish servant, a man who was not of her class, not of her education level, not appropriate company for a monarch. And the rumours started. Oh, the rumours. Some people whispered that Victoria and Brown were having an affair. Some went further and claimed they had secretly married. There were satirical cartoons in newspapers showing Victoria and Brown in compromising situations. People started calling her Mrs. Brown as a joke, or maybe not as a joke. It was meant to humiliate her, to suggest she had forgotten her position, forgotten her dignity, forgotten the man she claimed to mourn so devotedly. And the thing is, we will never know for certain what the true nature of their relationship was. Victoria's journals from this period are detailed about many things, but she is carefully vague about Brown. After Victoria died, her son Bertie, King Edward VII by then, destroyed a lot of correspondence between Victoria and Brown. He burned letters, removed diary pages, eliminated evidence. Why? Probably to protect his mother's reputation. Probably because he was embarrassed by the whole thing. Bertie had never liked Brown anyway. So whatever the full truth was, it is lost to history. But here is what we do know. We know that Victoria was not physically intimate with Brown. Multiple people, her doctors, her ladies-in-waiting, people who saw her daily, testified to this, and given how carefully the Queen was watched, given how many people would have been scandalised and would have spoken up, it seems unlikely they could have hidden an affair even if they wanted to. So no, probably not a sexual relationship. But was it an emotional affair? A deep friendship? A surrogate for the companionship she lost when Albert died? Absolutely. Victoria herself admitted that Brown gave her something she desperately needed, a sense of being cared for in a simple, uncomplicated way. There is this one incident that really captures their dynamic. In 1872, Victoria was getting out of her carriage at Buckingham Palace when a man rushed forward and tried to force her to sign a petition. When she refused, he became aggressive, and John Brown, who was right there as always, physically stepped between the man and the Queen and shoved the man away. It turned out later that the man was not actually trying to hurt Victoria. He was just a mentally unwell person with a bizarre grievance. But in that moment, Brown did not hesitate. He protected her with his body. And Victoria was so grateful, so touched by this act of loyalty, that she gave Brown a special medal for bravery, which seems over the top for dealing with an unarmed petitioner, but it shows how much she valued him, how much his presence made her feel safe. Victoria's children hated this, hated John Brown, hated how much influence he had over their mother, hated how he spoke to her, hated how she seemed to prioritize him over them. There is this particularly painful episode in 1870 when Victoria fell seriously ill with an abscess. She was in terrible pain, possibly delirious with fever, and Brown was permitted to see her. He brought her tea, sat with her, comforted her. But her own children, they were not allowed in the room. Victoria specifically requested that they not visit because she did not want them to see her weak. But Brown could see her weak. That was okay. Can you imagine how that must have felt to her adult children, to be shut out while a servant was let in? It reinforced their sense that their mother cared more about this Scottish man than she did about her own family. And maybe there was some truth to that. Not because Victoria did not love her children, she did, in her complicated way, but because loving her children was tangled up with guilt and grief and all these heavy emotions. Whereas with Brown, it was simpler. He had no expectations. He was not judging whether she was a good mother or a good queen. He just made her tea and told her to get some fresh air. Sometimes the relationships that save us are not the deep, complicated ones. Sometimes they are the simple, uncomplicated ones that ask nothing of us except to exist. But society could not accept this. The press continued to mock her. Political cartoons showed her as Mrs. Brown, the servant's wife. Parliamentary members started grumbling about funding a queen who had disappeared from public life to play house with her Scottish gilly. There were genuine concerns again about the future of the monarchy. Some people suggested that Victoria should abdicate, let Bertie take over, since she clearly was not capable of performing her duties properly. And all of this criticism stung. Victoria read the newspapers. She knew what people were saying, but she refused to give up John Brown. She defended him fiercely. Anyone who criticised him to her face got a sharp response, because Brown represented something she could not explain and refused to apologise for: a lifeline, a reason to keep going, a small piece of normalcy in a life that had become unbearable. In 1868, Victoria even tried to publish a memoir of sorts about her time in the Scottish Highlands, which would have included extensive praise of John Brown. Her private secretary, Sir Henry Ponsonby, and the Dean of Windsor, Randall Davidson, both saw early drafts and were horrified. They basically begged her not to publish it. They said it would fuel the rumours, that it would damage her reputation irreparably, that people would assume she was confirming an inappropriate relationship. And Victoria reluctantly agreed to kill the publication. But she was angry about it. She felt like she was being forced to hide something innocent, something beautiful, just because small-minded people could not understand it. The years passed. 1870s rolled into the 1880s. Victoria slowly, very slowly, started to return to public life more regularly. The grief over Albert was still there. It never left, but she had learned to function around it. She opened Parliament. She attended some ceremonies. She showed her face to her people just enough to quiet the Republican rumblings, and through it all John Brown was there, aging alongside her, still gruff, still loyal, still treating her like woman instead of your majesty. Then, in March of 1883, Victoria had an accident. She fell down some stairs at Windsor Castle. It was a bad fall. She injured her leg, and it left her partially lame. She struggled to walk properly for months afterward, and never fully recovered. And just 10 days after that accident, John Brown died. He caught a bad chill that turned into erysipelas, a bacterial infection of the skin. He was dead within days. He was only 56 years old. Victoria was shattered all over again. Here is how she described it in her journal. The loss of this friend, which is irreparable, has been a blow so overwhelming. She wrote letters comparing her grief for Brown to her grief for Albert, which, to her children reading those letters, must have been absolutely infuriating. Your mother is saying that the death of a servant affects her as much as the death of your father. But Victoria meant it, because by this point, Brown had been her daily companion for 22 years. 22 years of small kindnesses, of gruff affection, of uncomplicated loyalty. That is longer than she had with Albert. That is most of her adult life. And Victoria immediately tried to do what she had tried before, honour him publicly. She commissioned a statue of Brown. She wanted to publish a memoir about him, a proper one this time. She started writing a tribute that she planned to print and distribute. But again, her advisers intervened. Again, they told her it would be scandalous, that people would mock her, that the monarchy could not afford another scandal. So the manuscript was destroyed. The eulogy Victoria wrote was never published. The statue was quietly placed somewhere private where the public would not see it. But Victoria did manage one thing. In 1884, she published More Leaves from the Journal of a Life in the Highlands, which was basically a sequel to an earlier book she had written, and she dedicated it to John Brown. She called him her devoted personal attendant and faithful friend, which was the most she could do publicly without causing a complete scandal. It was her way of saying, he mattered. He meant something to me. Do not pretend he did not exist. So what do we make of all this? What does the John Brown chapter of Victoria's life tell us? I think it tells us a few things. First, that grief makes us need things we might not have needed before. Victoria had been independent, strong-willed, capable. But Albert's death broke something in her, and she needed Brown's particular brand of no-nonsense care to put some of those pieces back together. Second, that companionship does not have to look conventional to be meaningful. Brown was not her intellectual equal. He was not of her social class, but he gave her something real and valuable, and that mattered more than propriety. Third, that society loves to sexualize deep friendships, especially between men and women. Maybe because we cannot imagine caring deeply about someone without it being romantic or sexual. But Victoria and Brown show us that intimacy has many forms, and sometimes the most healing form is the simplest. Someone who just shows up every day and treats you with basic kindness. But here is the tragic part. Victoria's dependence on Brown, her need for his presence, also isolated her further from her own family. Her children felt rejected. They felt like she was replacing their father, their actual father, with this servant. And they resented her for it. Which means that in seeking comfort, Victoria inadvertently damaged relationships that she would later desperately want to repair. Because Brown could not give her everything. He could not give her intellectual stimulation. He could not help her navigate political decisions. He could not be a grandfather to her grandchildren. He was one kind of support. But she needed other kinds too. And by investing so heavily in this one relationship, she neglected others. Which brings us to the heart of our next conversation. Because we need to talk about Victoria's children in more detail. Those 9 people she brought into the world, resented bringing into the world, loved fiercely, but struggled to connect with. Because Victoria's relationship with her children is maybe the most complicated, most painful part of her emotional life. She wanted so badly to be a good mother. She wanted to give them what she never had. But her own childhood trauma, her grief, her temperament, it all got in the way, and the result was a family full of love and full of dysfunction in equal measure. So let us talk about what happens when a woman who never learned how to receive love tries to give it to her children. Spoiler alert, it gets messy. I wonder if you have ever met someone who loves you fiercely but cannot seem to stop criticizing you, who wants the best for you but defines the best so narrowly that you can never quite measure up, who hugs you with one arm and pushes you away with the other. That was Victoria as a mother. And the tragedy is, she knew she was doing it. She would write in her letters about wanting to be closer to her children, about regretting her harshness, about wishing things were different. But knowing and changing are 2 different things, are they not? Especially when your own childhood gave you no template for healthy love. So let us talk about Victoria's 9 children and the beautiful, painful, complicated web of relationships she built with each of them. Let us start with Vicki, the eldest, Princess Victoria, named after her mother, born in November 1840. From the very beginning, Victoria had complicated feelings about this child. On one hand, Vicki was bright, talented, everything Victoria could have hoped for in a daughter. She was intellectually curious like Albert, politically astute, spoke multiple languages fluently. Victoria was proud of her. But Vicki was also a reminder of everything Victoria hated about motherhood. The loss of autonomy, the physical toll, the way pregnancy had temporarily diminished her power. So Victoria's relationship with Vicki was this strange mix of pride and resentment, closeness and distance. When Vicki was 17, Victoria arranged for her to marry Prince Frederick of Prussia, the heir to the German throne. Now, this was actually a smart political move. It would strengthen ties between Britain and Prussia, potentially create a more liberal German state under British influence. And Vicki, to her credit, seemed genuinely fond of Frederick. But 17. She was 17 years old, leaving home to live in a foreign country, to navigate a court that was much more rigid and conservative than the British one. And Victoria? Victoria was devastated to lose her, but would not admit it. Instead, she became controlling. Over the next 40 years, Victoria and Vicki exchanged over 8,000 letters. 8,000. That is not a typo. They wrote to each other constantly, sometimes multiple times a day. And these letters were not just, "How are you? The weather is lovely" kind of letters. They were detailed, intense, often critical. Victoria would tell Vicki exactly how to raise her children, exactly what political positions to take, exactly how to manage her household. She gave Vicki detailed instructions on everything from what to wear to how to arrange her furniture. And when Vicki did not follow these instructions, Victoria would write back with thinly veiled disappointment or outright criticism. There is this one letter where Victoria is telling Vicki how to handle pregnancy and childbirth. And remember, Vicki is in Prussia, far from home, probably scared, probably needing actual support. And what does Victoria write? She launches into this long lecture about how Vicki needs to endure it stoically, how complaining is unbecoming, how she must remember her duty. Then she adds something like, and I am paraphrasing, "Though of course it is a miserable business and you have my sympathy." It is classic Victoria, harsh advice wrapped in the thinnest layer of empathy. She could not help herself. She wanted to be comforting but only knew how to be instructive. "And here is the thing that really gets me," Vicki wrote back faithfully, every single time. She never stopped trying to please her mother. She never stopped seeking Victoria's approval, even as an adult, even as the Crown Princess of Prussia, even when she had her own children and her own responsibilities. She was still that little girl trying to make her mother proud. And sometimes Victoria would write lovely, warm letters full of affection. But then the next letter would be critical again. It was emotional whiplash. And Vicki endured it for decades because that is what happens when you grow up with inconsistent love. You keep trying to earn the good version. You keep hoping that this time you will finally get it right. Now let us talk about Bertie. Oh, Bertie, the future King Edward VII, the son Victoria blamed for Albert's death. We touched on this earlier, but let me give you more details because the way Victoria treated Bertie is genuinely heartbreaking. From childhood, Bertie struggled. He was not a natural student. He had trouble focusing on his lessons. He was much more interested in socializing, in sports, in having fun than in the serious academic program Albert had designed for him. And Victoria and Albert were so disappointed. They wrote to each other about how Bertie was not living up to expectations, how he was lazy, how he lacked intelligence. They said these things not just privately, but sometimes in ways Bertie could overhear or sense. Imagine being that child, knowing your parents think you're a disappointment, knowing that no matter what you do, it will never be enough because you are not the son they wanted you to be. Bertie acted out naturally. He had temper tantrums. He was rebellious. And Victoria would respond by being stricter, more controlling, more critical. It was a cycle. Her criticism made him rebellious. His rebellion made her more critical. Round and round. And then Albert died. And Victoria told Bertie, actually told him, that his behaviour had killed his father, that if Bertie had not gotten into that scandal at Cambridge, Albert would not have made that trip in the rain, would not have gotten sick, would not have died. She said this repeatedly, for years. Bertie was 20 years old when his father died, and his mother essentially said, "This is your fault. You killed him. How do you recover from that? How do you build a relationship with a parent who blames you for the worst thing that ever happened to her?" The answer is, you do not, really. Bertie and Victoria maintained a formal relationship for the rest of her life. He did his royal duties. He visited when required. But there was always this coldness between them, this unhealed wound. Victoria could barely stand to look at him. She refused to give him any real responsibilities because she did not trust his judgment. When he wanted to see government papers to understand the work he would one day inherit, Victoria said no. She kept him at arm's length from actual governance until he was nearly 60 years old. Can you imagine? The heir to the throne kept in the dark about how to do the job, because his mother could not forgive him for something that was never his fault to begin with. But here is where it gets really complicated. Victoria also worried about Bertie constantly. When he got sick, she panicked. When he travelled, she fretted. She loved him. She just could not show it in a way that felt like love. She could only show it through criticism and control, and Bertie, for his part, tried. He tried to please her. He tried to be the son she wanted. But he also lived his own life. He had affairs, lots of them. He gambled. He ate too much, drank too much, lived too much. And every bit of news about his behaviour that reached Victoria just confirmed her low opinion of him. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. She expected him to disappoint her, so he did. Or maybe he would have disappointed her no matter what, because she had decided so early on that he was not good enough. Then there is Beatrice, the youngest, Victoria's baby. Born in 1857, the last of the 9 children. And Victoria loved Beatrice with this fierce, possessive love that was almost suffocating. After Albert died, when the older children had mostly left home, Beatrice became Victoria's companion, her helper, her constant presence, and Victoria depended on her completely. Beatrice managed Victoria's correspondence, organised her schedule, kept her company during the long evenings. She was essentially Victoria's unpaid personal assistant and emotional support animal rolled into one. And when Beatrice fell in love, when she decided at age 27 that she wanted to marry Prince Henry of Battenberg, Victoria lost her mind, not publicly. Victoria did not throw tantrums in public, but privately, she was furious. She felt betrayed. How dare Beatrice want to leave her? How dare she choose a husband over her mother? So Victoria did something absolutely wild. She stopped speaking to Beatrice for months. They lived in the same house, saw each other every day, and Victoria communicated with her youngest daughter only through written notes. Imagine that. Your mother, the Queen, sitting across the breakfast table from you, refusing to speak to you because you want to get married. This silent treatment, the emotional manipulation, the attempt to control through withdrawal of affection. Eventually, Beatrice and Henry came up with a compromise. They would get married, but they would live with Victoria. Henry would give up his own career, his own home, his own independence, and they would both stay at court to continue serving the Queen. And only then, only when Beatrice agreed to never really leave, did Victoria start speaking to her again and give permission for the marriage. And you know the saddest part? This arrangement worked for 16 years. Beatrice lived with her mother, managed her mother's affairs, put her mother's needs first for 16 years of her marriage, until Henry died suddenly in 1896 while on military duty. And then Beatrice was a widow at 39, still living with her mother, still serving her mother, having given up so much of her own life for Victoria's emotional needs. Let me tell you about Leopold, Victoria's youngest son. He was born in 1853 with haemophilia, a genetic blood disorder that Victoria unknowingly carried and passed down. We will talk more about the haemophilia epidemic she accidentally created in European royal families later, but for now, let us focus on what it meant for Leopold personally. He could not run and play like other children because any injury might cause unstoppable bleeding. A simple bruise could become life-threatening. And Victoria was terrified for him constantly. She overprotected him to an extreme degree. She would not let him do anything even remotely risky. He was educated at home while his brothers went away to school. He was kept close, kept safe, kept almost like a prisoner of his own fragility. And Leopold hated it. He was intelligent, curious, desperate for independence. But Victoria's fear, rooted in love, absolutely rooted in love, became a cage. She monitored everything he did. When he finally convinced her to let him attend Oxford University, she had him watched constantly. She sent reports back to her about his health, his activities, his social life. When he wanted to travel, she tried to forbid it. When he fell in love and wanted to marry, she initially opposed it because she worried about him having children who might also have haemophilia. Everything Leopold wanted, Victoria's anxiety got in the way. Leopold died at 30 years old. He slipped, hit his head, and the bleeding could not be stopped. And Victoria was devastated, but also, in some terrible way, felt vindicated. All her fears had come true. She'd been right to worry. But being right did not bring Leopold back. And one has to wonder, would Leopold's 30 years have been happier if his mother had worried less? If she had let him live more fully, even knowing the risks? It is an impossible question. But it is the question that haunts every overprotective parent. At what point does keeping someone safe become preventing them from living? Now, I want to tell you about something truly bizarre that shows just how controlling Victoria could be. She monitored her daughter-in-law Alexandra's menstrual cycle. Yes, you read that correctly. Alexandra married Bertie in 1863, becoming Princess of Wales, and Victoria had her household staff keep track of when Alexandra was menstruating, so that Victoria could make sure no important social events or public appearances were scheduled during those times. She did not ask Alexandra to do this herself. She had other people spy on the princess's personal health information. Can you imagine? The invasion of privacy, the complete lack of boundaries. And Victoria thought this was appropriate. She thought this was her being helpful, being considerate, being a good mother-in-law. The fact that it was deeply inappropriate apparently never occurred to her. Victoria also played favourites, and her children knew it. She clearly preferred some children over others, and she was not particularly subtle about it. She adored Arthur, her third son, who had a military career and rarely caused her trouble. She was fond of Alice, her second daughter, who was gentle and dutiful. But she was obviously harder on Bertie, more critical of Louise, who was too independent for Victoria's liking, more demanding of Vicki. And children notice these things. They notice when a sibling gets warmer treatment. When someone else gets more praise, it creates resentment. It creates competition. It creates wounds that last a lifetime. Do you know what Victoria once wrote to Vicki? She wrote something like, It is not possible to be on happy, friendly terms with people you have just been scolding. And that was her problem right there. She thought the job of a mother was to constantly correct, to always be pointing out flaws and mistakes and areas for improvement. She wrote to Vicki that she believed a mother's function was to be always correcting, scolding, ordering them about and organising their activities. That was her actual parenting philosophy. Is it any wonder her children felt like they could never relax around her? That they could never just be themselves without fear of judgment? But here is what breaks my heart. Victoria knew. She knew she was not the mother she wanted to be. There are letters where she admits that she wishes she were warmer, more affectionate, easier to talk to. She would write to her older children lamenting that she only checked in on the younger ones every 3 months or so. She was aware of her failures, but awareness and change are not the same thing. She was trapped in patterns laid down by her own childhood. She had never been shown unconditional love, so she did not know how to give it. She'd been controlled, so she controlled. She'd been criticized, so she criticized. The cycle perpetuated itself. And yet, and this is important, Victoria's children loved her. Despite everything, they loved her. They wrote to her, visited her, sought her approval even as adults. Because love is complicated. Because you can recognize your parents' flaws and still love them. Because family bonds are not simple equations of good treatment equals love and bad treatment equals hate. They are messy and contradictory and human. Bertie, even after everything Victoria put him through, wept at her deathbed. Vicki wrote thousands of letters trying to maintain a connection. Beatrice gave up decades of her life to care for her mother. That is love. Complicated, painful, imperfect love, but love nonetheless. So what can we learn from Victoria's failures as a mother? Perhaps this, that trauma does not excuse harmful behaviour, but it does explain it. That you can love your children desperately and still hurt them terribly. That good intentions do not magically create good outcomes. That breaking generational cycles of dysfunction requires not just awareness, but active, difficult work on yourself. And that sometimes the greatest gift we can give our children is not perfection, but honest acknowledgement of our imperfections and a sincere effort to do better. Victoria's complicated relationships with her 9 children reveal so much about who she was beneath the crown. She was not a villain. She was not a monster. She was a woman carrying so much unresolved pain that it spilled out onto the people she loved most. And that pain was about to take on a whole new dimension, because Victoria did not just pass down emotional patterns to her children. She passed down something else, something genetic, something that would change the course of European history and haunt her with guilt for the rest of her life. The haemophilia I mentioned with Leopold, that was just the beginning. So let us talk about what happened when one genetic mutation in one queen's DNA spread across an entire continent through royal marriages, causing suffering and death for generations, and how Victoria came to see herself as the source of a curse she never meant to cast. Sometimes the worst legacies are the ones we never intended to leave, the gifts we thought we were giving that turn out to be curses, the blessings that become burdens for generations to come. And for Queen Victoria, her genetic legacy became exactly that, a shadow that followed her descendants across Europe, causing pain and death in ways she could never have anticipated. They called it the royal disease, but its scientific name is haemophilia, and understanding what Victoria unknowingly unleashed requires us to talk about blood, genes, and the cruel mathematics of inheritance. Haemophilia is a bleeding disorder. Your blood contains proteins called clotting factors. Think of them like tiny construction workers whose job is to build a scab when you get cut. They rush to the scene, start stacking up, forming a barrier to stop the bleeding. In people with haemophilia, one of these clotting factors does not work properly. So when they bleed, from a cut, a bruise, or even internally from normal physical stress, the blood does not clot the way it should. Minor injuries become major problems. A scraped knee can bleed for hours. A bump to the head can cause internal bleeding that will not stop. In severe cases, people with haemophilia can bleed spontaneously into their joints and muscles, causing excruciating pain and permanent damage. Now here is the genetic part, and stay with me, because this is important. Haemophilia is caused by a mutation on the X chromosome. Women have 2 X chromosomes, men have 1 X and 1 Y. If a woman has the haemophilia mutation on one of her X chromosomes, her other X chromosome usually has a working copy of the gene, so she is a carrier but does not have symptoms. But if she passes that mutated X chromosome to her son, and he only has 1 X chromosome, he has no backup. He has haemophilia. It is a sex-linked recessive disorder, which means it almost exclusively affects males but is passed down through females. The women carry it silently, unknowingly, and watch their sons suffer. Victoria was a carrier. Nobody knows exactly where the mutation came from. The most likely explanation is that it was a spontaneous mutation, a random copying error in the DNA when Victoria's father's sperm was being formed. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, was 51 years old when Victoria was conceived, and the rate of spontaneous mutations increases dramatically with paternal age. So Victoria was probably born with this mutation, brand new to the royal line, courtesy of biology's occasional mistakes. But there is also some recent research suggesting that maybe Victoria inherited it from her mother's line, from relatives nobody tracked carefully because they were minor German nobility. Either way, Victoria had it, and she had no idea until it was too late. Leopold was born in 1853. From early childhood he bruised easily. He would bleed from minor cuts far longer than normal. The doctors were puzzled. This was decades before anyone understood genetics, or had a name for haemophilia beyond bleeding disease, or blood taint. They just knew Leopold was fragile in a way his brothers were not, and Victoria watched her son suffer, watched him be limited in ways other children were not, watched him live with constant pain and the knowledge that any accident could kill him, and she blamed herself. Not because she understood genetics, she could not, but because mothers always blame themselves when their children suffer, do not they? Leopold died at 30, as I mentioned. But what I did not tell you yet is this. Victoria had 9 children. 3 of them, Leopold and 2 daughters, Alice and Beatrice, inherited her genetic legacy. Leopold had the disease. Alice and Beatrice were carriers, which means they looked perfectly healthy but carried the mutation in their DNA, ready to pass it to their own children. And those children married into royal families across Europe. Because that is what royalty did. They married each other. They formed political alliances through matrimonial bonds. And in doing so, they spread Victoria's genetic mutation across an entire continent. Let me trace this for you because the web of suffering is staggering. Alice, Victoria's second daughter, married Louis IV of Hesse, a German prince. They had 7 children. 2 of her sons had haemophilia. Friedrich bled to death at age 2 after falling from a window. Just 2 years old. Can you imagine? A toddler, playing near a window, normal childhood curiosity, and it kills him because his blood will not clot. Alice's daughter Alex, Victoria's granddaughter, was a carrier, and Alex married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia and became Tsarina Alexandra, and they had a son. Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, born in 1904, heir to the Russian throne, and Alexei had haemophilia. Now, the story of Alexei's haemophilia is not just a family tragedy, it is a historical turning point. Alexei was the long-awaited male heir after 4 daughters. The entire Russian dynasty depended on him, but he was constantly ill, constantly bleeding. His joints would swell, he would scream in pain, and there was nothing the doctors could do. So Alexandra, desperate to save her son, turned to a mystic named Grigory Rasputin. You've heard of Rasputin, right? The mad monk? The mysterious figure who supposedly had magical healing powers? Well, here is the thing. Rasputin actually could help Alexei. Not through magic, but likely through hypnosis and calming techniques that lowered Alexei's blood pressure and stress, which reduced bleeding. But it looked like magic. It looked like this peasant holy man had power over life and death. So Alexandra gave Rasputin enormous influence over the royal family. And the Russian court was scandalized. The public was outraged. This unkempt, inappropriate peasant whispering in the Tsarina's ear, making decisions about government policy. It eroded faith in the monarchy. It made Nicholas and Alexandra look weak, superstitious, unfit to rule. And when the Russian Revolution came in 1917, when the Bolsheviks rose up and demanded change, the Romanov family's reputation had already been destroyed partly because of their association with Rasputin. And why did they need Rasputin? Because Alexei had haemophilia. And why did Alexei have haemophilia? Because his great-great-grandmother, Queen Victoria of England, carried a genetic mutation she did not know she had. In 1918, the entire Romanov family, Nicholas, Alexandra, Alexei, and his 4 sisters, were executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries. Alexei was 13 years old. The haemophilia did not kill him. Bullets did. But the haemophilia changed the course of Russian history, weakened the monarchy, contributed to circumstances that led to that basement in Ekaterinburg where they were all shot. And in 2009, when scientists finally analyzed DNA from the remains of the Romanov family that had been discovered years earlier, they confirmed it. Alexei had haemophilia B, the rarer, more severe form, and they could trace it directly back to Victoria's line. One mutation, one chromosome, ripple effects across a century. But Russia was not the only country affected. Beatrice, Victoria's youngest daughter, also carried the mutation. Her son Leopold had haemophilia and died at 32. Another son, Maurice, probably had it too. He died at 23 in World War I, and while the official cause was combat injuries, he bled out far too quickly from wounds that should not have been fatal. And Beatrice's daughter, Victoria Eugenie, was a carrier. She married King Alfonso XIII of Spain in 1906. And 2 of their sons had haemophilia. The Spanish case is particularly tragic because Victoria Eugenie did not know she was a carrier when she married Alfonso. Nobody had explained it to her. Nobody had done the genetic math. So when her first son was born and started showing symptoms, Alfonso was furious. He felt deceived. He felt like the British royal family had hidden this taint to secure the marriage. And he blamed Victoria Eugenie for the rest of their marriage. Their relationship disintegrated. One son died at age 31. Another renounced his claim to the throne because he did not want to risk passing the disease to his own children. The Spanish royal line was deeply impacted by this mutation that came from England, from Victoria, from one tiny error in DNA replication decades earlier. Do you see the pattern? Do you see how one person's genetics, combined with the royal practice of intermarriage, created this cascade of suffering? At least 10 of Victoria's descendants had haemophilia, At least 15 were carriers. The disease spread to the royal families of Germany, Russia, and Spain. It killed children and young men. It influenced political decisions. It changed the course of history, and Victoria watched it happen. She lived long enough to see some of her grandsons die from this disease. She lived long enough to understand, at least partially, that she was the source, and the guilt she felt was immense. There are letters from Victoria's later years where she references this terrible disease in our family and expresses horror at its spread. She did not have the vocabulary or scientific understanding to explain it, but she knew it came from her. She knew her daughters were passing it to their children. She knew her genetic legacy was pain, and there was nothing she could do about it. She could not go back and change her DNA. She could not protect her grandchildren. She could only watch and grieve and feel responsible for suffering she never intended to cause. Here is something that makes it even more complicated. Victoria herself probably struggled with some symptoms that we now recognize as potential signs of being a carrier. Some women who carry haemophilia mutations do have mild symptoms: heavier menstrual bleeding, easy bruising, longer bleeding after childbirth. And Victoria did have issues with bleeding. After several of her childbirths, she bled more heavily than expected. She bruised easily, but nobody connected these dots. Nobody thought, maybe the Queen has a bleeding disorder that she is passing to her children. They just thought she was delicate or recovering poorly from pregnancy. The medical knowledge was not there yet. The term haemophilia was only coined in 1828, when Victoria was 9 years old, and even then doctors did not understand what caused it or how it was inherited. The concept of genes would not be discovered until the 1860s by Gregor Mendel, and even then his work was not widely known until the early 1900s. So Victoria lived her entire life without understanding the mechanism of what she had passed down. She just knew that some terrible invisible thing was killing her male descendants. It must have felt like a curse, like divine punishment, like something out of a Greek tragedy where the sins of the parent are visited upon the children, except Victoria had not sinned. She had just been born with a mutation. In 2009, when scientists confirmed through DNA analysis that the Romanovs had haemophilia B specifically, they also confirmed something else. Haemophilia B is quite rare. Only about 15% of haemophilia cases are type B. The rest are type A. So Victoria happened to carry one of the rarer, more severe mutations. If there is such a thing as genetic bad luck, she had it. And through no fault of her own, she became known as the source of the royal disease. Her legacy included not just an era, not just an empire, but a genetic mutation that plagued European royalty for generations. What can we take away from this? First, that biology does not care about your intentions. Victoria wanted to give her children life, love, opportunity. She gave them haemophilia instead, or at least the risk of it. Second, that guilt over things beyond our control is a particularly cruel form of suffering. Victoria could not have known. She could not have prevented it. But she blamed herself anyway because that is what we do when we love someone. We want to protect them, and when we cannot, even for reasons entirely beyond our control, we feel like we have failed. Third, that medical knowledge is power. If Victoria had understood genetics, if genetic testing had existed, she might have made different choices. Her daughters might have known they were carriers before having children. Families could have been warned, but that knowledge came too late for Victoria's line. And finally this, that our legacies are complicated. Victoria gave the world so much: political stability, cultural advancement, a model of constitutional monarchy that still functions today. but she also gave the world haemophilia. She was the grandmother of Europe in two ways, through her descendants who sat on nearly every European throne, and through a genetic mutation that those same descendants carried. She was both blessing and curse, and she had to live with knowing that, had to carry that weight on top of all her other sorrows. But even genetic curses were not the only danger Victoria faced in her long life, because while some threats came from within, encoded in DNA and blood, others came from outside, from strangers with guns and knives and grievances, from people who wanted her dead for reasons both political and deranged. And Victoria survived more assassination attempts than almost any monarch in history. So we need to talk about what it does to a person to live under constant threat, to know that any public appearance might be your last, to face death repeatedly and still keep showing up, keep doing the job, keep being visible to your people. Because that is another kind of courage that Victoria had, a kind we have not talked about yet, and it is time we did. Picture yourself leaving your house every day knowing that someone somewhere might try to kill you. Not a vague possibility, not an abstract threat, an actual documented pattern of people pointing weapons at you. Would you still go outside? Would you still show your face? Or would you lock the doors and never come out? Victoria chose to keep going outside, and over the course of her 63-year reign, at least 7 people tried to assassinate her. 7 times someone attempted to end her life, and each time she survived. But survival comes with a cost, does it not? A psychological toll that accumulates, a fear that never quite goes away. So let us talk about what it means to live under constant threat and still refuse to hide. The first attempt happened in 1840, just 4 months into Victoria's marriage, when she was pregnant with her first child. She was 20 years old. 20. Barely more than a girl. She was riding in an open carriage with Prince Albert, heading to visit her mother, and suddenly a young man stepped forward from the crowd. His name was Edward Oxford. He was 18 years old, and he raised a pistol and fired. The shot missed. Victoria and Albert froze, and before anyone could react, Oxford fired again. That shot also missed, or maybe the gun was not properly loaded, accounts vary, but 2 shots, 2 attempts in a matter of seconds, and Oxford just stood there, holding the smoking pistols until police tackled him to the ground. Victoria's reaction. She was remarkably calm, almost unnaturally so. She wrote in her journal that night that she was not frightened, but that Albert had been so pale with terror. She was more worried about her husband's reaction than her own near-death experience, which tells you something about Victoria's psychology, does it not? This ability to dissociate from danger, to compartmentalize fear. It is a trauma response, actually. When something is too overwhelming to process in the moment, your brain just does not process it. You go numb, you function mechanically, you save the emotional reaction for later, if at all. Oxford was tried for high treason. The punishment for high treason was death. But his lawyers argued he was insane, and the jury agreed. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to an asylum indefinitely. Years later, he was released and sent to Australia to start a new life. Which seems wild, right? You try to kill the Queen and eventually they just ship you off to another continent and let you go. But that was British justice in the 1840s, and oddly enough, the assassination attempt actually helped Victoria's popularity. The public was outraged on her behalf. Suddenly she was not just the Queen but a victim who needed protecting. Her subjects rallied around her. So there was a silver lining, if you can call it that. But the attempts did not stop. In May of 1842, Just 2 years later, Victoria was riding in her carriage along the Mall in London when another man, John Francis, stepped out of the crowd and pointed a pistol at her. This time, the gun did not fire. It clicked, misfired, and Francis ran away before he could be caught. Now, most people in Victoria's position would have said, "That is it. I am not going out in public anymore. Clearly it is not safe." But Victoria did something extraordinary. The next day she deliberately rode the same route, at the same time, in an open carriage. Essentially, she used herself as bait. Her advisors thought she was insane. Albert was terrified but supported her decision, and Victoria's reasoning was brilliant, actually. She knew Francis would try again if he thought he had failed. So rather than hide and let him escape, she gave him another opportunity. But this time there were plainclothes police officers scattered throughout the crowd, watching, waiting. And sure enough, Francis appeared again. He raised his pistol. He aimed. And just as he pulled the trigger, the police grabbed him. He was arrested, tried, and this time there was no insanity defense. He was sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to transportation, meaning he was shipped to Australia. What kind of person uses themselves as bait to catch an assassin? What kind of courage or recklessness or stubbornness does that take? And Victoria was pregnant during this incident too, about 5 months pregnant with her second child. She was literally risking 2 lives to catch one criminal. When people criticised her for taking such a risk, she reportedly said something along the lines of it being her duty, that she could not live in fear, that if she hid, the monarchy would appear weak, and she was not wrong. A visible monarch is a strong monarch, but the psychological cost of that visibility must have been enormous. Just 2 months later, July 1842, another attempt. A man named John William Bean pointed a pistol at Victoria's carriage, but this time the gun was not even properly loaded. It had paper and tobacco in it, but no bullet. Bean was clearly disturbed, not actually intending to kill, just wanting attention maybe. But Victoria did not know that in the moment, did she? She saw a gun. She heard a click. For the 3rd time in 2 years, someone had pointed a weapon at her. Bean was sentenced to 18 months in prison, light sentence because the gun was not loaded. But the psychological impact on Victoria was the same. Loaded or not, she still experienced the threat. She still felt the fear, or should have felt it, though she kept insisting she was not afraid. Then nothing for 7 years. 7 years of peace. Maybe Victoria thought it was over. Maybe she let herself relax a little. And then in 1849, an unemployed Irish immigrant named William Hamilton fired a powder-filled pistol at her carriage as she rode along Constitution Hill. Again, no actual bullet, but the explosion, the noise, the shock. Hamilton was sentenced to 7 years of transportation, and Victoria kept going out in public, kept riding in open carriages, kept being visible. In 1850, the attacks took a different form. A man named Robert Pate, who was actually a former military officer, not some random disturbed person, walked up to Victoria's carriage and struck her in the face with his cane, hit her hard enough to bruise her and crush her bonnet. This was not a gun. This was direct physical assault, and it shook Victoria more than the gun incidents had, because Pate got close. He touched her. He violated her personal space in a way the gun-wielding assassins had not. Pate was also sentenced to transportation, 7 years in Australia. But the damage was done. Victoria started to understand that the threat could come from anywhere, in any form. Do you notice the pattern here? 5 attempts in 10 years, from 1840 to 1850. That is 1 attempt every 2 years on average. That is not ancient history we're talking about. That is recent memory, over and over. That is ongoing trauma. That is living with constant vigilance. And yet Victoria refused to change her behaviour. She refused to hide. She continued her public duties. She continued riding in open carriages. Why? Was it courage? Duty? Or was it something else? Maybe a kind of fatalism? A sense that if someone wanted to kill her badly enough, they would find a way, so why bother hiding? There is also a possibility that modern psychologists would recognise Victoria might have been experiencing a form of dissociation, or even subconscious death wishes. Remember, she was still dealing with the aftermath of her difficult childhood, her complicated relationships, her struggles with motherhood. Is it possible that some part of her did not care if she died? That facing these threats felt less frightening than facing her own internal pain? It is dark, but it is worth considering, because her apparent fearlessness in the face of repeated assassination attempts is not entirely normal. Most people would develop intense anxiety, phobias, PTSD symptoms. But Victoria kept functioning as if nothing had happened. Then came a long break. Over 20 years with no attempts. Victoria aged. She went through Albert's death and her long mourning. She became the widow of Windsor. And maybe people thought, who would attack a grieving old woman? Who would try to harm someone so obviously in pain? But in 1872, another attempt. A man named Arthur O'Connor pointed an unloaded pistol at Victoria as she was returning to Buckingham Palace. And who intervened? John Brown. Remember him from earlier? Victoria's devoted Scottish attendant. Brown physically grabbed O'Connor, wrestled him to the ground, and likely saved Victoria's life, or at least saved her from the terror of another gunshot, real or fake. Victoria was so grateful that she gave Brown a special gold medal. And the incident deepened her reliance on him, which we talked about before. The last major attempt was in 1882 at Windsor train station. A man named Roderick Maclean fired a pistol at Victoria's carriage as she arrived. This time, bystanders attacked Maclean with umbrellas before he could fire again. There is something almost comical about that image, is it not? The Queen saved by angry citizens wielding umbrellas. But it speaks to how much public sentiment had shifted. By the 1880s, Victoria was beloved. She was no longer the controversial widow of Windsor. She had become a symbol of British stability and power, and people were genuinely outraged that anyone would try to harm her. Maclean was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to an asylum. So let us add it up. 7 documented assassination attempts over 42 years, and Victoria survived all of them. But what does surviving that many attacks do to a person? Even if you show no outward fear, even if you keep functioning, the body keeps score, as they say. Trauma accumulates. And I think this helps explain some of Victoria's later behaviours. Her need for control, her difficulty trusting people, her tendency toward anxiety and depression. When you live under constant threat, when you never know if today is the day someone succeeds in killing you, it changes how you see the world. Everyone becomes a potential enemy. Every crowd becomes a danger. Every public appearance becomes an act of courage or an act of self-destruction, depending on how you look at it. And here is something that often gets overlooked. What about Albert? What about her children? They had to watch this happen. They had to live with the knowledge that their wife, their mother, was a target. Albert was traumatized by these events. Multiple accounts describe him going pale, shaking, struggling to sleep after the attempts. He was terrified of losing Victoria. And the children? They grew up knowing that any time their mother went out in public, she might not come back. That has to shape you, does it not? That has to create its own kind of anxiety and hypervigilance. Victoria's courage in continuing to perform her public duties despite these threats is admirable. It really is. But I also wonder if it was entirely healthy. If maybe sometimes courage and trauma response can look the same from the outside but feel very different from the inside. Was Victoria brave, or was she simply too numb to feel the appropriate fear? Was she dedicated to duty, or was she running from internal pain by focusing on external danger? Maybe both. Maybe courage is always complicated. Maybe it is never as simple as fearlessness. Maybe it is choosing to function despite fear, despite trauma, despite every instinct telling you to hide. There is a quote attributed to Victoria, though I cannot confirm it is exactly accurate, where she supposedly said something like, "We are not interested in the possibilities of defeat. They do not exist." That is such a Victoria thing to say, is it not? This refusal to acknowledge vulnerability, this insistence on strength even when strength should not be possible. It is admirable and sad at the same time, because refusing to acknowledge defeat is powerful, but refusing to acknowledge fear and trauma means you never properly process it. You just carry it forever. And Victoria did carry it, all of it. The assassination attempts, the childhood trauma, the grief, the guilt over haemophilia, the complicated relationships with her children, the loss of Albert, the loss of her mother, the loss of John Brown. She just kept accumulating losses and traumas and dangers, stacking them up one on top of another, and somehow staying upright under the weight. But nobody can carry that much forever, can they? Eventually something has to give. Eventually the weight becomes too much, and for Victoria the breaking point was not one single trauma. It was the accumulation, the relentless piling on of loss after loss after loss, until she was buried under them, which is where we are heading next, because we need to talk about the cascade, the domino effect of deaths that defined Victoria's later years. Her mother, then Albert, then Alice, then Leopold, then John Brown, then more grandchildren, more losses, more grief layered on top of old grief that never healed. We need to talk about what happens when death becomes your most constant companion, when you survive everything life throws at you, only to watch everyone you love not survive. So stay with me, because this next part is going to hurt. But it is also going to show you the true depths of Victoria's strength, not the refuse to acknowledge defeat kind of strength, but the keep going even when you want to die kind of strength. The quiet, unglamorous, grinding strength of surviving loss after loss after loss. They say grief comes in waves, but what happens when the waves never stop? When you're still reeling from one loss and another one crashes into you? When you barely have time to catch your breath before the next blow comes? That was Victoria's reality for decades, and I want to take you through the year that broke her, 1861, because understanding that year is key to understanding why the losses that came after hit so much harder, why each subsequent death did not just hurt on its own, but reopen every wound that came before. We have talked about March 16th, 1861, when Victoria's mother died. That moment of sitting by her bedside, holding her hand, feeling her breath stop. The guilt that flooded in afterward when Victoria found her mother's letters and realised how much she had been loved all along. That alone was devastating. That alone would have been enough grief for 1 year. But Victoria did not get 1 year. She got 9 months. 9 months between her mother's death and Albert's death. 9 months where she was trying to process losing her mother while still being a wife, a mother to 9 children, a queen with duties and responsibilities. She did not have the luxury of falling apart. She could not take a year off to grieve properly. She had to keep functioning. And just as she was starting to find some equilibrium, Just as she was beginning to accept her mother's death and move forward, December came, and Albert got sick, and on December 14th, 1861, he died. Same year. Both of the people who had defined her adult life, her mother and her husband, gone within 9 months of each other. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine losing your parent and your spouse in the same year? The compounding of it. The way the second loss does not just add to the first, but multiplies it. Because now you are grieving both, and the grief for one triggers the grief for the other, and you cannot separate them, cannot process them individually, cannot find solid ground anywhere. Victoria wrote in her journal that after Albert died, she felt like everything in her life had been swept away. And I think part of what she meant was that 1861 had taken both her past and her future. Her mother represented her childhood, her origins, her complicated history. Albert represented her present and her future, her partnership, her purpose, and in 1 year, both were gone. The grief from 1861 never fully healed. It could not. Victoria did not have the time or space or support to properly process such massive loss. So it stayed with her, raw and open, an unhealed wound. And then came more losses, because life, in its cruelty, was not done with Victoria yet. December 14th became a cursed date in Victoria's mind, the anniversary of Albert's death. Every year she would withdraw completely on that day, cancel all appointments, spend hours in Albert's rooms, weep, remember, relive. It was her most sacred, most painful day. And then, in 1878, 17 years after Albert died, Victoria received news on December 14th. Her daughter Alice, her second daughter, had died of diphtheria on the exact anniversary of her father's death, December 14th. Victoria was shattered all over again. She wrote that this was too terrible to comprehend, that it felt like a nightmare, like some cosmic punishment. Her beloved Alice, dead at 35, leaving behind 7 children, and dying on that specific date felt like, what? A sign, a curse, just the universe's sick sense of timing. Whatever it was, it meant that December 14th now held 2 deaths, 2 unbearable losses layered on top of each other. Every year after 1878, Victoria was not just mourning Albert, she was mourning Alice too. The grief doubled. The day became even more untouchable. And here is something that makes it even more heartbreaking. Alice had been one of the daughters Victoria was closest to. Alice had helped nurse Albert during his final illness. She'd been gentle, devoted, caring. And after Albert died, Alice had tried to comfort Victoria, tried to help her mother through the grief even though she was grieving her father too. Alice was good, she was kind, and she died young, in pain, away from her mother. Victoria did not get to say goodbye, did not get to hold her hand the way she had held her mother's hand. She just got a telegram, "Your daughter is dead." On December 14th, the worst day of your life just got worse. Then, in 1884, Leopold died. Victoria's youngest son, the one with haemophilia, the one she'd tried so desperately to protect. He was 30 years old. He slipped and fell in Cannes, France, and the internal bleeding could not be stopped. And Victoria, who had spent 30 years terrified that something like this would happen, had to face her worst fear coming true. The death notification came on March 28th, just 12 days after the anniversary of her mother's death. And then Victoria remembered John Brown had died on March 20th of the previous year, 1883. So now late March was also a time of death and grief. The calendar was filling up with cursed dates, days Victoria dreaded as they approached each year. Here is what cumulative grief does. It changes how you experience time. Every month becomes a minefield of anniversaries. Every season carries memories of past losses. Spring is not just spring. It is when Leopold died, when John Brown died, when Mother died. Winter is not just winter. It is when Albert died, when Alice died. Summer becomes the only relatively safe season. But even then, you're just waiting for autumn and winter to come back around. You're never free. You're always either actively grieving or anticipating the next grief. Does that make sense? Time stops being neutral. It becomes weaponized. And the deaths kept coming, but now they were not just her children. They were her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren. The grief became exponential. When you have 9 children and they have 42 children between them, and those children start having children, you have this enormous family tree, which sounds wonderful, which should be wonderful, but it also means more people to lose, more funerals to attend, more telegrams announcing deaths, more black mourning clothes to wear, though Victoria never stopped wearing black anyway. Victoria became a great-grandmother in 1879. She was 60 years old, and you would think this would be a joyful milestone. Great-grandchildren, the continuation of the family line. But Victoria described herself as feeling old and sorrowful. She wrote to a friend that every new birth made her anxious rather than happy, because she knew, she had learned, that birth is just the beginning of vulnerability. Every new baby is someone else you can lose. Every grandchild who has children is creating more people for you to grieve eventually. It is a terrible way to think about family, is it not? But when you have lost as much as Victoria had lost by that point, when death has become your most familiar companion, you cannot help but see every hello as a future goodbye. And Victoria's body was breaking down too. In March of 1883, yes, another March tragedy, she fell down some stairs at Windsor Castle. It was a bad fall. She injured her leg, and it left her partially lame. She could not walk properly for months. The doctors told her she would recover fully, but she never did. For the rest of her life she walked with difficulty. She had pain. She needed assistance getting around. And just 10 days after that fall, John Brown died. So she was physically injured and emotionally devastated at the same time. The physical pain and the emotional pain blurred together, became one overwhelming experience of suffering. Victoria also developed rheumatism, a painful inflammation of the joints that made movement difficult. She started having vision problems, cataracts forming, making it harder to read and write. She'd always been a voracious reader, had always kept detailed journals, and now even that was becoming difficult. Her hands ached, her eyes strained. Her body was betraying her in small ways that accumulated into major limitations. She was not dying, but she was aging in a way that hurt, constantly. Do you know what chronic pain does to mental health? It is not just the physical sensation, it is the relentlessness of it, the way it is always there, always demanding attention, always reminding you that something is wrong. Chronic pain and depression feed each other. The pain makes you depressed. The depression makes the pain feel worse, round and round. Victorian attitudes toward aging and suffering did not help. The prevailing belief was basically, you are old, of course you are in pain, just endure it stoically. There was very little in the way of pain management. Some laudanum maybe, which is opium-based and addictive. But mostly, people were just expected to suffer quietly, to maintain dignity, to not complain. And Victoria tried. She really did. But her journals from this period are filled with references to pain, to tiredness, to feeling overwhelmed. She was human, she hurt, and she admitted it, at least in private. Here is something that strikes me about Victoria's later years. She became the person everyone turned to when they were grieving, because she had survived so much loss, because she'd kept functioning despite everything. Her children and grandchildren would write to her when they experienced their own tragedies. They would ask for her advice, her comfort, her wisdom about how to keep living when someone you love dies. And Victoria would write back with surprisingly compassionate, honest letters. She would share her own experiences. She would admit that the pain never fully goes away, but that you learn to carry it, that you find reasons to keep going even when you do not want to. There is this letter Victoria wrote to her granddaughter after the granddaughter's child died, and Victoria wrote something like, "I am paraphrasing. I know the terrible feeling that God is being cruel, that He is taking away everyone you love, but somehow you must find strength, not for yourself, but for the others who need you. That is what I have done. I keep going for my children, for my grandchildren, for my country, not because I want to, but because I must." And that is it not? That is the definition of resilience. Not bouncing back, not recovering, not being strong, but continuing to function despite carrying unbearable weight. Continuing to show up even when every cell in your body wants to stop. By the 1890s, Victoria had outlived so many people. Her mother, her husband, 2 of her children, multiple grandchildren, her beloved John Brown, most of her advisors, most of her friends from her youth. She had become this living monument to survival. People looked at her and saw strength, stability, endurance, the eternal queen who had been there forever and would be there forever. But Victoria looked in the mirror and saw an old woman covered in invisible scars. She saw someone who had survived by sheer stubbornness and duty, but who was tired, so tired. There is a concept in psychology called complicated grief, or prolonged grief disorder. It is when grief does not follow the normal trajectory of acute pain gradually lessening over time. Instead, it stays intense for years. It interferes with your ability to function. It dominates your emotional landscape. And one of the factors that predicts complicated grief is having multiple significant losses in close succession without adequate time to process each one. Victoria had textbook complicated grief, multiple massive losses, inadequate processing time, ongoing responsibilities that prevented her from falling apart, the perfect recipe for grief that never heals. But here is what Victoria also had. Purpose. She had a job that required her to keep showing up. She had people depending on her. And as much as that responsibility was a burden, it was also, I think, what saved her from completely succumbing to despair. Because when you have grief that overwhelming, sometimes the only thing that keeps you going is external obligation, not inspiration, not hope, just duty. Just the next thing on the schedule that must be done, and then the next thing, and then the next. Until somehow you have gotten through another day, and then another week, and then another year. And then somehow, inexplicably, you have survived for 40 years past the loss you thought would kill you. Victoria used to say, after Albert died, that she was just waiting to die so she could be reunited with him. She said this for decades, but she did not die. She kept living. Her body kept going even when her spirit wanted to stop. And over time, I think her goal shifted from waiting to die to doing what needs to be done until death comes, which is less romantic but more sustainable. You cannot live your whole life just waiting for death. Eventually, you have to find some reason to engage with life, even if that reason is just duty, even if it is just not wanting to let people down. By the late 1890s, Victoria was in her late 70s. She had been queen for over 60 years, She had survived everything, but she was tired. So tired. The losses had carved her out, left her hollow in places. The physical pain was constant. The grief was layered like sedimentary rock, each loss a distinct layer, but all of them pressing down together. And Victoria was reaching the end. She could feel it. Her body was slowing down. Her mind was not as sharp. And unlike the Victoria of 40 years earlier who longed to die, this Victoria was almost ready, not eager, but accepting, because she had done enough, survived enough, endured enough. And what comes after survival and endurance? What comes when you have carried weight for so long that you cannot remember what it felt like not to carry it? That is what we are going to explore next. Because Victoria's final year, 1900 into 1901, tells us something profound about what it means to approach death when you've lived a very long life full of very heavy grief. How she planned her own funeral, how she faced the end with characteristic stubbornness and surprising peace, how she left instructions for everything because even in death she wanted to maintain some control. So stay with me as we walk Victoria through her final months, her final days, her final breaths, because the way we die says something about the way we lived, and Victoria's death was as complicated, as contradictory, and as deeply human as her life had been. There is a particular kind of darkness that descends when your mind starts to betray you, when you cannot quite remember what you did yesterday, when words that should come easily suddenly hide from you, when you look at familiar faces and feel a flicker of uncertainty about who they are. Victoria had survived assassination attempts, grief, physical pain, political crises. She had endured for 8 decades with her sharp mind intact. But in her final year, that mind began to slip away. And for a woman who had always prided herself on mental clarity, on being able to outthink her advisors, on maintaining control, losing cognitive function was perhaps the cruelest loss of all. August 17th, 1900. Victoria made what would be her final journal entry as a functioning person. She was 81 years old. She'd been keeping diaries since she was 13, 68 years of daily entries documenting her entire life. Thousands upon thousands of pages. It was her most consistent habit, her way of processing the world. And that August day, she wrote her last coherent entry. After that, the entries become shorter, more confused, sometimes just fragments that do not quite make sense. Her handwriting, which had always been neat and controlled, became shaky. Words were misspelled. Sentences trailed off incomplete. It is heartbreaking to see these final journal pages because you can watch her mind deteriorating in real time right there on the paper. Her personal physician, Sir James Reed, kept detailed notes during this period, and from his observations, along with Victoria's own words when she could still express them clearly, modern geriatricians have retrospectively diagnosed what Victoria was experiencing: late-life depression with vascular dementia. Let me break that down. The vascular part means it was caused by poor blood flow to her brain. Small strokes, probably. Tiny blockages that killed off bits of brain tissue one at a time. And with each little death, Victoria lost a little more of herself: memory, language, spatial awareness, the ability to reason through complex problems. It came in waves. Some days she was mostly herself, other days she was lost in fog. The depression component was not new. Victoria had battled depression for decades after Albert's death. But now it was compounded by the cognitive decline, by the physical pain from her rheumatism and her injuries, by the exhaustion of being 81 years old and having ruled for 63 years. She told Sir James Reed during one of her clearer moments that she was tired, so very tired, that she had done her duty, that she was ready to rest. and there was something almost peaceful in that admission. After 40 years of saying she wanted to die, she finally meant it in a calm, accepting way rather than a desperate, grief-stricken way. But even as her mind and body failed, Victoria maintained her stubbornness. She refused to stay in bed. She insisted on getting dressed every day, even though it took hours and exhausted her. She insisted on seeing government papers, even though she could no longer fully understand them. She insisted on maintaining her schedule as much as possible, because to Victoria, stopping meant admitting defeat, and she was not ready to admit defeat. Not yet. Even if her body was clearly telling her it was time. Sir James Reed was in an impossible position during these final months. He was Victoria's doctor, but he was also essentially caring for the head of state. And the royal family was in turmoil. Bertie, the Prince of Wales, was desperate to know how much longer his mother had. Not because he was eager for her to die. Despite their difficult relationship, he did care for her, but because he needed to prepare. He was 60 years old and had been waiting to be king his entire life. And now, finally, it was happening. But nobody could tell him when. Victoria could die in days or weeks or months. The uncertainty was agonizing for everyone, and the political implications were enormous. Victoria had ruled for so long that there were people in Britain who had never known another monarch. She was stability personified. What would happen when she died? Would the monarchy survive the transition? Would Bertie, who had such a scandalous reputation, be accepted as king? These questions hung over everything. So Sir James Reed was not just managing one elderly patient, he was managing the end of an era, and he did it with remarkable compassion and skill, trying to keep Victoria comfortable while also keeping the family informed and the government stable. In late December of 1900, Victoria went to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. It was her favourite residence, the place where she felt most at peace. She had not spent Christmas at Windsor that year because she did not have the strength to travel back and forth, and besides, she knew, she must have known, that this was her last Christmas, that she would not leave Osborne alive. She spent the holiday quietly, surrounded by family, too tired to participate much in the celebrations but present, watching her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, watching life continue, watching the world that would go on without her. Into January 1901, Victoria's condition worsened rapidly. She was confused more often than she was lucid. She had trouble recognizing people. She would call for Albert, forgetting he had been dead for 40 years. She would ask for her mother. She would drift in and out of consciousness, and the family started gathering. They all knew the end was near. Bertie came and stayed. So did Wilhelm, Victoria's grandson, the Kaiser of Germany. Multiple children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren filled Osborne House, waiting, watching, grieving in advance. On January 17th, Victoria suffered what was probably a significant stroke. She lost the ability to speak clearly. She could barely move. Sir James Reed knew she had only days left, and he faced the difficult task of telling her family, while also trying to provide what comfort he could to Victoria herself. There were no effective treatments, no way to stop what was happening. All he could do was manage her pain, keep her clean and comfortable, and be present. It was palliative care in its most basic form, and by all accounts, he did it beautifully. Victoria was not alone during her final days. Someone was with her constantly, holding her hand, talking to her, even when she could not respond. Bertie sat with her for hours. So did Wilhelm. Her daughters took turns, and Sir James Reed was there almost continuously, monitoring her breathing, her pulse, trying to gauge how much time was left. It is an act of love, is it not? Sitting with someone as they die, not trying to fix them or save them, just being present, bearing witness to the end of a life. It is one of the most human things we can do for each other. On January 22nd, 1901, around 6:30 in the evening, Victoria's breathing changed. It became laboured, irregular. The family was summoned immediately. They crowded into her bedroom. Bertie held one of her hands. Wilhelm held the other. And at 6:30 p.m, Queen Victoria took her last breath. She died in the arms of her son and grandson. After 81 years of life, after 63 years of ruling, after 40 years of widowhood, after decades of grief and pain and duty, she was done. She was finally done. The room was silent for a moment, and then someone, I believe it was Bertie, said, "The Queen is dead. Long live the King," the ritual words that mark the transition of power. Victoria was gone, and Edward VII was now King of England. The Victorian era, officially and symbolically, was over. And do you know what is strange? For a few hours the world did not know. They kept Victoria's death quiet overnight, not announcing it publicly until the next morning. So there was this brief window where one of the most famous women in the world was dead, but the world kept turning as if she was still alive. I find that oddly comforting, that for a few hours life just went on, that her death did not immediately shatter everything, that the world was more resilient than anyone had feared. But here is where Victoria's personality shines through one final time. She had planned her own funeral, down to minute details. She had written specific instructions years earlier about exactly how she wanted to be buried, and those instructions were, well, they were very Victoria, controlling to the end, but also deeply revealing about what mattered to her. First, she did not want a lying in state. She did not want her body displayed for public viewing. She wanted privacy in death, even though she had been so public in life. Second, she wanted a white funeral, not all black, white, because she said she was going to be reunited with Albert, and reunion should be celebrated, not mourned. White for hope, white for joy, white because this was not an ending but a beginning of being together again. It is heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time, is it not? After 40 years of black mourning clothes, she finally chose white for her own farewell. Third, she wanted it to be a military funeral, not a state funeral. Her father had been a military man, the Duke of Kent, and she wanted to honour that connection. So her coffin was transported on a gun carriage. Soldiers lined the streets. It was grand and martial and impressive. But also, I think, it was Victoria saying, I was not just a queen. I was a daughter. I was a person with a history before the crown. Remember that about me. And fourth, this is the part that gets me. Victoria left detailed instructions about what should be placed in her coffin. She wanted to be buried in her wedding veil, the white lace veil she wore when she married Albert 61 years earlier. She wanted Albert's dressing gown laid over her. She wanted photographs of her children and grandchildren placed around her. And she wanted specific mementos from people she had loved. One of John Brown's photographs, a lock of his hair. She wanted these things buried with her, even though she knew her family would not approve, especially Bertie, who had hated Brown, but she did not care. She wanted what she wanted, and Sir James Reed, bless him, followed her instructions exactly. He placed John Brown's photograph in her left hand, covered it with flowers so the family would not see, and sealed the coffin. There is something both sad and defiant about that. Victoria, even in death, claiming her right to honour the people she had loved, regardless of whether those relationships were socially acceptable. She had spent so much of her life conforming to expectations, performing her role as queen. But in death, she took back some autonomy. She included John Brown in her eternal rest, and nobody could stop her. It was a small rebellion, but for Victoria, it meant everything. The funeral itself was massive. Heads of state from across Europe attended. Crowds lined the streets of London as her coffin passed by. The procession was miles long, and people wept, genuinely wept, because whatever else Victoria had been, difficult, controlling, sometimes harsh, she had been their queen for most of their lives. She was stability. She was history. She was the grandmother of Europe, literally and figuratively. And now she was gone. Victoria was buried next to Albert in the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore, Windsor, finally together again, the reunion she'd been waiting for since December 14th, 1861. 40 years she waited, 40 years of grief and longing, and now, in death, she got what she wanted, to be beside him forever. Whatever you believe about the afterlife, whatever you think happens after death, you have to admit there is something poignant about that, about a love so strong that it endures decades past death, about a woman so devoted that she structured her entire life and death around reunion. So what do we make of Victoria's death? What does it tell us? I think it tells us that even at the end we want to maintain some control. Victoria planned every detail because letting go completely was too frightening. But I also think it tells us that we take with us, into death, the things that mattered most. And for Victoria, that was Albert, yes. But also her children's faces, also John Brown's memory, also the symbols of her life, the wedding veil, the photographs, the mementos. We cannot take our bodies, we cannot take our accomplishments, but we try to take love, in whatever form we can. Victoria died having survived everything life threw at her. Every loss, every grief, every assassination attempt, every political crisis, every personal failure. She survived it all. And she did it not because she was superhuman, but because she had no choice. Because duty demanded it. Because people depended on her. Because stopping was not an option. And that, more than anything, is what we should remember about her. Not that she was perfect, not that she was always right, but that she showed up. Day after day, decade after decade, she showed up and did the work, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Which brings us to our final question. What does Queen Victoria teach us? What can we learn from this complicated, contradictory, deeply human woman who ruled an empire while falling apart inside? That is what we need to explore in our conclusion. Because Victoria's story is not just history, it is a mirror. It reflects back to us truths about grief, about resilience, about the cost of duty, about the complexity of love. So let us spend our final moments together pulling these threads tight. Let us ask what it means to be strong when strength is the only option, what it means to love imperfectly, what it means to survive when everyone you love does not. Let us find the lessons in Victoria's sorrows and see what wisdom we can carry forward from this woman who felt everything, survived everything, and somehow kept going until the very end. So here we are, at the end of Victoria's story, and if you have stayed with me through all these hours, through all this pain and complexity and humanness, I want to thank you. Because this has not been an easy journey, has it? We have walked through childhood trauma, through impossible grief, through genetic curses and assassination attempts, and the slow erosion of a mind that once commanded an empire. We have seen Victoria at her worst and her best, her cruelest and her most tender. And now we need to ask, what does it all mean? What do we take away from the hidden sorrows of a woman who died over a century ago? Let me start with what Victoria was not. She was not a victim. Yes, terrible things happened to her. Yes, she experienced trauma that would break most people. But Victoria was not passive in her suffering. She fought. She survived. She made choices, sometimes good choices, sometimes terrible ones, but they were her choices. She was not just blown around by fate. She was an active participant in her own life, even when that life was unbearably painful. And I think that distinction matters, because victimhood implies powerlessness, and whatever else Victoria was, she was not powerless. But she was also not a saint. She was not some perfect example of noble suffering. She hurt people. She manipulated her children. She blamed Bertie for Albert's death for 40 years. She was petty and controlling and often incapable of showing love in healthy ways, and acknowledging that does not diminish her. It actually makes her more real, more relatable. Because none of us are perfect, are we? We all carry our trauma in ways that sometimes hurt the people we love. The question is not whether we are flawed. Of course we are flawed. The question is whether we can acknowledge our flaws and try, however imperfectly, to do better. Did Victoria try to do better? Sometimes. Her letters show moments of self-awareness, moments where she recognized her own failures as a mother, as a person. But self-awareness did not always lead to change. And I think that is one of the most important lessons we can learn from her. Knowing you have a problem does not automatically fix the problem. Insight is valuable, but it is not the same as transformation. Victoria knew she was too controlling with Beatrice. She still stopped speaking to her for months over a marriage. Victoria knew she blamed Bertie unfairly. She still could not stop herself from seeing him as responsible for Albert's death. Knowledge and behaviour are not the same thing, and real change requires more than just understanding. It requires consistent, difficult, ongoing work. But here is what Victoria did do. She showed up. For 63 years, through every conceivable kind of pain, she showed up and did her job. She signed documents when her hands ached with arthritis. She met with ministers when she could barely think through her depression. She appeared in public when she knew someone might try to shoot her. She kept going when most people would have stopped. And that is a particular kind of strength that our modern culture does not always appreciate. We celebrate people who overcome their trauma, who heal, who transform their pain into wisdom and joy. And that is wonderful when it happens. But what about the people who do not overcome? What about the people who just endure, who carry their pain every single day and still get up and do what needs to be done? That is Victoria. That is her legacy. Not overcoming, enduring. And maybe that is the more common human experience anyway. Maybe most of us do not dramatically overcome our trauma. Maybe we just learn to function around it, to carry it, to keep going despite it. Is that less admirable than healing? I do not think so. I think there is profound courage in simply continuing, in refusing to give up even when giving up would be so much easier. Victoria could have abdicated. She could have let Bertie take over in 1861 when she was destroyed by grief. Nobody would have blamed her, but she did not. She kept going. And I think she deserves credit for that, even as we acknowledge all her failures. Let us talk about what Victoria's relationship with her mother teaches us. Because that story of reconciliation coming too late is painfully common, is it not? How many of us have complicated relationships with our parents? How many of us swing between anger and love, resentment and longing? How many of us realize only after they are gone how much we were loved, or how much we loved them despite everything? Victoria spent decades pushing her mother away, only to discover after her mother's death that the love had always been there, just hidden, just expressed badly, just tangled up in manipulation and fear and all the complicated emotions that make family relationships so difficult. What could Victoria have done differently? She could have tried harder to understand her mother's position. The Duchess was a widow in a foreign country, with limited options and a daughter who represented both her hope and her burden. Did that excuse the Kensington system? No. Did it excuse allowing Conroy to torment Victoria? No, but it explains it. An explanation, while not excuse, can lead to compassion. If Victoria had tried to see her mother as a whole person, flawed, frightened, trying her best with limited tools, maybe they could have reconciled earlier. Maybe those 24 years of coldness could have been something warmer. But Victoria could not do that. She was too hurt, too angry, too stuck in her own pain to make space for her mother's pain. And by the time she could, it was too late. What does that teach us? Maybe it teaches us not to wait. If there is someone in your life you are estranged from, someone you love but cannot quite forgive, maybe do not wait until they are on their deathbed to try to understand them. Because death has a way of clarifying things, of making us see what we could not see when the person was alive. But that clarity comes too late. It does not help the relationship. It just adds guilt to the grief. So maybe, if you can, try now. Try to see the whole person. Try to understand their context, their limitations, their own trauma that shaped how they treated you. It does not mean excusing them. It just means being willing to hold complexity, to acknowledge that people can fail us and love us at the same time. And Victoria's relationship with Albert, what do we learn from that? We learn, I think, about the dangers of making another person your entire world. Victoria and Albert's love was real. It was deep. It was passionate. But it was also codependent. Victoria could not make a decision without Albert. She defined herself entirely through him. And when he died, she did not just lose her husband, she lost her identity, she lost her sense of purpose, she lost the framework through which she understood herself and the world. And that kind of loss is catastrophic in a way that losing a partner in a healthier relationship is not. Because in a healthier relationship you maintain your sense of self even while being deeply connected to another person. You have your own thoughts, your own preferences, your own identity that exists separate from the relationship. Victoria did not have that. She was Victoria and Albert, and when Albert was gone, she did not know how to be just Victoria. So what is the lesson? Maybe it is this. Love deeply, love passionately, but do not lose yourself in the process. Maintain your own identity. Have your own interests, your own friendships, your own sense of purpose that is not entirely dependent on another person. Because people die, or they leave, or they change, and if your entire self is wrapped up in them, what happens to you when they are gone? You disappear. And that is what happened to Victoria. Part of her disappeared with Albert, and she spent the rest of her life trying to be a ghost of Victoria and Albert, instead of figuring out who Victoria alone could be. Victoria's struggles with motherhood teach us about generational trauma, about how the patterns of our childhood replicate themselves in how we parent our own children, even when we desperately do not want them to. Victoria knew what it felt like to have a controlling mother. She hated it. And yet she became controlling herself. She knew what it felt like to be emotionally manipulated. She hated it. and yet she manipulated Beatrice into staying with her. Why? Because those were the tools she had. That was the model of parenting she knew, and breaking those patterns requires more than just awareness. It requires new tools, new models, new ways of relating, and Victoria did not have access to those. She did not have therapy. She did not have parenting books. She just had her own painful childhood and the vague sense that she wanted to do better, but no roadmap for how. What does that mean for us? It means we need to be intentional about breaking cycles. It means seeking help, therapy, books, support groups, whatever tools are available in our time. It means recognizing when we are repeating patterns we swore we would never repeat and actively working to change them. It is hard. It is ongoing. It requires constant vigilance. But it is possible in a way it was not possible for Victoria. We have resources she did not have, and if we have those resources, we have a responsibility to use them, not just for ourselves, but for the next generation. The haemophilia story teaches us about unintended consequences, about how our actions or even our genetics can ripple out in ways we never anticipated. Victoria could not have known she carried haemophilia. She could not have prevented it. But her genetic legacy changed the course of European history, and she had to live with knowing that. What do we take from that? Maybe just humility, the recognition that we cannot control everything, that sometimes, despite our best intentions, we cause harm, and when that happens, all we can do is acknowledge it, feel the appropriate grief and guilt, and keep going. Victoria carried the weight of haemophilia for decades. It did not destroy her, but it shaped her. It added another layer to her already overwhelming sense of responsibility and failure, and she bore it because she had no choice. Because sometimes life gives us burdens we did not ask for and cannot put down, and the only option is to carry them. The assassination attempts teach us about courage, but not the Hollywood version of courage where you are fearless and heroic, the real version where you're terrified but you do the thing anyway. Victoria faced 7 assassination attempts. 7 times someone pointed a weapon at her, and she kept going out in public. Was that courage, or was it dissociation, or duty, or all 3? Maybe it does not matter. Maybe courage is not about the absence of fear. Maybe it is about functioning despite fear, about showing up even when showing up might get you killed. Victoria did that, and whatever her reasons, whatever her psychology, that took something. Something most of us do not have to find in ourselves because most of us are not repeatedly threatened with death. But the principle applies to smaller things too, does it not? Getting out of bed when you are depressed takes courage. Going to work when you are grieving takes courage. Having a difficult conversation takes courage. Courage is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is just continuing. Just one more day. Just one more step. Just not giving up. And finally, the cascade of losses teaches us about resilience, about what it takes to survive when survival seems impossible. Victoria lost her mother, her husband, her children, her grandchildren, her friends, her health, her mind. She lost almost everything, and she did not bounce back. She did not recover. She did not heal in any meaningful way. But she survived. She kept living for 40 more years after Albert died. 40 years of grief and pain and duty. And at the end, she'd become something different. Not stronger necessarily. Not better. Just persistent. Like a tree that keeps growing even after being struck by lightning. Scarred. Twisted. But still alive. Still there. Is that enough? Is mere survival enough to call a life successful? I think for Victoria it had to be, because transformation was not available to her. Healing was not available to her. All she could do was endure, and she did. And maybe that is enough. Maybe we do not all have to overcome our trauma to live meaningful lives. Maybe some of us are just meant to carry our trauma and keep going. And maybe that is okay. Maybe that is even admirable. Not inspiring in the way we usually mean that word, but real, honest, human. So what is Queen Victoria's legacy? Officially, it is an era. Victorian England, a period of industrial revolution, an imperial expansion, and social transformation. Her name is on an age. But her real legacy, I think, is this. She proved that you can be powerful and broken at the same time, that you can rule an empire and still cry every night for 40 years, that you can be tremendously strong and desperately weak in the same breath, that perfection is not required for greatness, that showing up even imperfectly, even while falling apart, counts for something. Victoria was not a role model in the traditional sense. She made too many mistakes. She hurt too many people. She failed too often. But she was real. She felt everything. She hid nothing in her private writings, and we are richer for that honesty, because her pain is recognizable. Her struggles are universal. Her humanity is undeniable. And in a world that often demands we pretend to be fine, to have it all together, to overcome our trauma and emerge stronger, there is something radical about Victoria's refusal to do that. She did not overcome. She did not emerge stronger. She just survived. And she did not apologize for her grief or her struggle or her messiness. She just was. Fully, completely, devastatingly human. So if you take one thing from Victoria's story, let it be this. You do not have to be perfect to matter. You do not have to overcome every obstacle to be valuable. You do not have to heal completely to deserve love and respect. Sometimes just surviving is enough. Sometimes just showing up is enough. Sometimes just being honest about how hard it is. That is enough. Victoria was honest. She wrote it all down. Her pain, her failures, her fears. And because she did, we get to learn from her. We get to see ourselves in her. We get to know that if a woman who ruled a quarter of the earth could fall apart and keep going, maybe we can too. Queen Victoria died on January 22nd, 1901. But her story did not end there. It lives on every time someone reads her journals and feels less alone in their grief. Every time someone recognizes their own complicated family dynamics in her relationship with her mother or her children. Every time someone survives something they thought would destroy them. Victoria is not just history. She is a mirror. And if we look closely enough, we can see ourselves reflected in her sorrows, her struggles, her stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up would have been so much easier. Thank you for spending this time with me, exploring the hidden emotional life of a woman who shaped an empire while barely holding herself together. Thank you for listening to a story that was not always easy to hear. Thank you for being willing to sit with discomfort and complexity and the mess of being human. I hope Victoria's story gave you something. Permission to be imperfect, maybe. Or comfort that you're not alone in your struggles. Or just a deeper appreciation for the fact that everyone, even queens, even the powerful and famous and historically significant, everyone is fighting battles we cannot see. If you enjoyed this journey through history and emotion, please consider subscribing to this channel. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more historical figures whose emotional lives have been hidden or forgotten or simplified beyond recognition. And I want to tell those stories with you. I want to keep exploring what it means to be human across time and place and circumstance. So subscribe, leave a comment telling me whose story you want to hear next. And until then, I hope you rest well. I hope you carry your own sorrows a little more gently, knowing that even queens carried theirs with difficulty. I hope you find moments of peace in the spaces between the waves of grief. and I hope you remember that surviving, just surviving, is enough. It was enough for Victoria, and it is enough for you too. Good night, and thank you for letting me share this story with you.